Bom dia a todos. I've been asked on behalf of our international guests to speak to you in English. So welcome to BNDS. It's a great pleasure for us to welcome you today and to be hosting this meeting, the inaugural workshop for the School for Policies, Innovation and Development Research. I understand that this is an initiative which has a focus of inquiry and discussion that is particularly relevant for an institution such as BNDS, in as much as you will be looking in a very detailed manner on a number of phenomena that have been going on in the past few years, but which have a direct bearing on development strategies and policy choices that governments and states are taking presently. And I mention governments and nation states because even though it has become sort of commonplace to say that after the crisis or the recent crisis there has been a resurgence of nation states or the role of nation states, for us here it's quite apparent that at least in capitalist economies this role of the state has never really gone away. It's always been there. It's always been fundamental in shaping policy spaces and in many cases in devising very active strategies for the pursuit of economic development. Having said that, it is for an institution such as BNDES with a mandate from the Brazilian government to foster and support and actively promote, indeed, a number of initiatives and projects that are the concrete expression of our pursuit of economic and social development. It is obviously very interesting and very capital to have a renewed effort of reflection and inquiry on just what it is that the various actors are, in terms of national governments and state policies, are doing these days. What we have observed is that we live in a time of divergence. I think there are divergent strategies, there are divergent policy strategies, and countries are dealing as best they can with the advantages, the instruments and the institutional ensembles that they have. And as they go along, they are trying to perfection the tools they have. They're trying to adapt to the circumstances around them. And out of this effort, which is only barely coordinated, international dialogue is these days much more intense, much more active, but the seat of decisions, of decision making, is still in government capitals and in country capitals all over the world. And so for researchers and analysts, it's really a tall order to be able to make sense of it all and try to discern the emergent patterns for the upcoming year. So we are very much interested not only in welcoming you and acting as a host, but actually we'll be taking notes and being a very studious observer of the activities that will be taking place in the next few days. So welcome, and I hope that you all have a very productive meeting, a very productive workshop at BNDES. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to keep my remarks brief and very informal. I'm going to start with this photo over there. This photo was taken at the 1997 International Seminar on Globalization and State Reform, a Comparative Perspective, organized by Leonardo Bulamarque and myself. You can see in the photo a couple, Antonio and Ana Castro, seemingly amazed by what they see in front of them. And at their side, Benjamin Correa, very suspicious of it all. What was in front of them might have been the intellectual context between Robert Wade, here, and Bresser Pereira on state reform, or Jan Kregel's or Giovanni Dosi's presentations during the conference. Many other friends and scholars were also there. Fred Bloch, Jeffrey Hodgson, Erich Heiner, Wolfgang Dreschler, all of them members of the Other Canon movement. What followed the 97 conference was a series of different courses with brilliant scholars, Brazilian and foreign, coming to Brazil to lecture for a week or two, to graduate students and policymakers from BNDES, FINEP, Petrobras, Banco do Brasil, and so forth. At that moment in time, their contributions changed minds and hearts, having great intellectual and policy repercussions. So what we are starting today, it's not so new. I kept thinking about playing with the idea what we are renewing and what's really new in this Spiderweb project we are embarking upon. We are certainly renewing the network of scholars, keeping in mind our broad theoretical and conceptual frameworks. I'll call them our roots: post-Keynesianism, Marxism and post-Marxism, evolutionary Schumpeterian approach, institutionalism and its approaches, Polanyian vision to code the more frequent influences and schools that crop up among us. But what we are enlarging and extending the group of members and maybe approaches of our diversified and very peculiar epistemic community. We certainly are renewing themes and issues. Some are our old but always evolving material that was undoubtedly renewed by the economic crisis, globalization and its consequences for developing countries, international global governance institutions and their power structure, varieties of capitalism and state capacity. This is the renewed vision of the Vox approach. Development and sustainability, innovation as a central dimension, and knowledge governance to introduce a new concept. Some issues are new or now have a great importance. China is the biggest example. At the moment, it's opportune to consider how emerging economies, such as Brazil, should structure its long-term growth prospects. The question is how to reconceive Brazil's international assertion as well as inter-regional, bilateral, multilateral relations. It seems urgent to evaluate development strategies and political options in an international economic and political order that combines multipolarity and increased competition. This seems new. It might be necessary to take into consideration the degrees of freedom and the degrees of constraint countries have to face in the international arena. As Jan Kregel pointed out at the end of his introduction, the current approach to global financial stability is in direct contradiction with the needs of developing countries, and it will imply the recognition that development will always involve international imbalances. We also see a new institutional framework for the school. At that time and until 2004, we had both the old graduate program at Federal Rural University and the Lato Sensu School at the Institute of Economics, with support coming from BNDES and FINEP. Today, this initiative arises from the graduate program of Public Policies, Strategies and Development at the Institute of Economics, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, which did not exist at that time, a young graduate program that started in 2008, and from the National Institute of Science Technology for Public Policy Strategies and Development, it started in 2009. The Spiderweb, although embedded in the graduate program and the Institute for Science Technology, aims to be a network of national and international graduate schools while also functioning as a school for advanced studies, a postdoc program mainly sponsored by CAPES, is responsible for the evaluation of graduate programs in Brazil, and our National Research Council. For this workshop, we also had the support of the Latin American Investment Bank, CAF, BNDES, IBRAC, Minds for Foundation, and I thank all institutions for this sponsorship. In sum, we have new members, new issues, and new institutional framework. But what is really new in the Spiderweb initiative? My answer would be, our needs have changed. It seems to me that we need a vision, an integrated vision coming from what I have called our conceptual roots. We need to engage in theoretical studies at the forefront, as well as empirical research with a comparative perspective, to enable us to advance knowledge for new, strong, relevant development strategies and implementation of effective public policies. Finally, we would like to find, and this is an expression in Portuguese, to find the pulo do gato. The pulo do gato. There is no translation for this, a special ingredient for our emerging middle-income developing countries like Brazil, China, India, South Africa, Mozambique, Poland, Argentina, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, and so many others. Antonio would love to be here for helping us in this task. Thank you.
Well, just a word of welcome. I'm the coordinator of the INCT, which is the National Institute for Science and Technology. I have to tell you a little bit what it consists of. It's an initiative of the innovation programs in Brazil. And the idea of the creation of these INCTs is like to bring together the production or to establish links between the production that takes place in the academy with that of decision makers, policy making, and being able to interconnect as well with the private world, the world of private enterprises. So this is the big conception behind the creation of the INCT. And ours is perhaps one of the very few that operates in the area of, let's put it broadly, humanities, with one specific characteristic, which is the fact that it brings together the work of economists and political scientists and social scientists. In other words, behind the conception of our INCT is in fact an endeavor of thinking problems of development in an integrated way. It's not, no longer the idea that economics operates separately from politics, but the idea that the two are embedded and work together. One cannot exist without the other. So this is the basic idea behind the creation of our INCT, which is devoted to the study of strategies of development. Okay, so today we inaugurate what we could say a second phase of our research network. We started with a large body of research integrating problems related to innovation, conceptions of development, and sustainable development on the other side. A number of these projects have ended now, and we started with a new one, which is basically part of the idea of interconnecting the world of academics with that of decision makers. And it's a project devoted to comparing the bricks, the so-called bricks, in a number of dimensions, which are important to conceive, to think, or to frame the issues of the national development in Brazil. So this research project which is the center of our INCT now, is already an initiative that brings together academics and the world of decision makers, as it is an initiative which is taking place in a partnership with IPEA, the Institute of Applied Economic Research. Okay, so this is one of the basic activities regarding the conception and the substantive work that we are devoted to in our INCT. But a second initiative is the one that Anna just mentioned, which brings us here today, which is the creation of this Spiderweb, the School for Policies, Innovation, and Development Research, which is a network, in fact, devoted to thinking or to constituting think tanks for rethinking problems of development and at the same time having a practical application in terms of formation and educational training and practical training for decision makers, students, graduate students alike. This initiative now that we are here today participating in is actually coming to reality of a first meeting, a first discussion that we had last year in Siena regarding the creation of this school and debating a number of substantive issues on the problems of development. And so I have to say that it's with an enormous pleasure that we are here today, seeing the concrete reality of our first endeavor, which was last year, as I said. And I have to say that this initiative only came to reality thanks to the entrepreneurship of Ana Célia Castro. In every context that I go to, I mention the fact that without Ana Célia's entrepreneurship, we wouldn't have initiatives such as the one that we have here today. Because she, not only took care of organizational matters. I was away. I was in Paris for these past 2 months. And not only Ana Célia took care of all the organizational details regarding this conference, but also she was an excellent fundraiser. And so we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the academic entrepreneurship of Ana Célia and the fact that this is, in fact, her pet project, and it became a reality thanks to her efforts. And so I'm very glad to welcome you all. And it's a very nice opportunity not only to discuss conceptual matters, substantive matters, but also, it's going to be the first time that the school will actually come into being. Because following this seminar, we will have the first courses which attracted an enormous number of participants, and so which is the outcome of our previous discussions, and we hope our substantive discussions here today. Thank you very much, and let's have a productive meeting. Quem que vai coordenar? Você? Você que coordena.
Não, Fernando.
Good morning. We are going to begin the first session of the workshop. Of course, we are running a little late, as it is the Brazilian tradition. We could begin earlier, but we didn't want to break the tradition. So what we are going to have, according to the instructions I got from Anna, is this first part of the morning that I'm going to chair. We're going to have two presentations by Jan and Roberto. And then we are going to have three comments from Luis Carlos, Rogério, and Gary. The general discussion is going to take place after the coffee break during the roundtable. So please take note of the arguments or points or criticisms that you would like to make. The first part of the session is only with the presenters. So the idea is to trying to minimize the delay. Roberto and Jan will have up to 20 minutes to make the initial presentation, and then each of the discussants will have up to 15 minutes to make the comments, and at the end I'm going to make some final comments as also Anna asked. So without any further delay, I'm going to follow the program, so Jan.
Thank you, Fernando. Since the text has been distributed, and since, as Fernando has mentioned, we're running slightly behind schedule, I will simply summarize and leave the more technical details to those of you who want to read the paper. I will have to say it's fortunate and unfortunate that Roberto is on the panel with me today, because much of what is presented here was already presented at the Festschrift that we had for Roberto in Buenos Aires 2 or 3 months ago. So he's going to be forced to listen to this a second time. The basic idea that I had in terms of setting out what discussion we could initiate for the first session was to look at what sort of, first of all, value added the initiative could provide in terms of giving a new context or a new way of discussing international relations, in particular in the monetary and financial field. And secondly, as Ana Celia has mentioned, trying to maintain an emphasis on developing countries, and in particular on middle-income developing countries. And then finally, how the representatives of middle-income developing countries could approach these particular problems, either through diplomatic means or through representation in multilateral financial institutions. And for that reason, we are very fortunate to have with us today Rogério Studer, who is a representative of a emerging market middle-income country. What country is that again, Rogério? This is Suriname. Yes, that's it, Suriname. Okay. So the idea is to try and frame this in terms of what a representative of an emerging market middle-income country could gain from exposure to the kinds of thinking that the school is supposed to represent. So the first point that I'd like to make is that if we currently look at the way emerging market economies, in particular developing countries, have approached their diplomatic representation and their ability to be represented in international fora, primarily this had followed what we might call the sort of seat of the pants approach. Now, the seat of the pants approach we can call the seat at the table approach. The idea is that developing countries have attempted to gain seats at the negotiating tables where international standards, international codes, international policies have in general been decided. And if we look at those international agencies, these that are formal and informal, there certainly has been recently an increase in representation of developing countries. Take the BIS as an example. The BIS very generously now deigns to invite a small number of emerging market countries to their deliberations. There's absolutely no evidence that there's any contribution to the final decisions that are made, but in fact, as I say, they get to sit at the table and they get to watch. An interesting part of this is that if you track down the names of the individual countries that have been invited to these informal arrangements, you discover that they're also the same countries that have been convoked to participate in the more formal arrangements. In particular, there's more or less a virtual one-to-one identity between those non-developed, call them non-developed countries that are part of the G20 and the ones that participate in all these other ranges. So more or less what has happened is that a clique, I would call them, of countries that are not necessarily developed have been invited, and they get to watch what goes on, but in fact they have very little impact in terms of what eventually gets decided. The evidence that we have for this basically comes from representatives in those meetings and in the discussions that I've had prior in my former hat as a international civil servant working for the United Nations, or in terms of advising governments. It is quite clear that in most of these fora, the decisions are made either by the G1 or the G2, or possibly by the G3. An anecdote which is told by a friend of mine from a Latin American developing country, in which he was representing the central bank of that country in a G20 meeting, in which a proposal was put on the table that was drafted by the U.S. Treasury, and he was asked to approve it, and he said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I can't approve this because it goes against the principles that we have in the central bank." And the response was, "Well, it's been drafted by the U.S. Treasury, and we had a meeting in Washington after the crisis in which all heads of state signed off on these particular principles, therefore you are required to approve it." And his response was, "Well, my central bank has a statute, and that statute gives the central bank autonomy from the government, and therefore I am not bound by the decisions that my government has taken." Anyway, to make a long story short, the idea that I'm trying to put forward is that in general the thrust that developing countries have done is to try and get a bigger say in the existing multilateral institutions, both those of a formal and an informal nature, and in particular this takes the form of the battle that we've seen inside the World Bank and the IMF over the distribution of quotas and the size of quotas and the number of seats on the executive board. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that this is probably a very short-sighted, if not mistaken, approach for developing countries to take, because implicitly what it does is that it signs off on the basic principles that these institutions have accepted since their creation and since their foundation. And the second point that I would like to make then is simply taking the example of the IMF. If we look at the fundamental principles of the IMF, they were set up in order to create what we call international financial stability in support of free trade, basically in support of the idea that exchange rate changes or exchange rate, what were then called competitive devaluations, should be eliminated because they could distort trading patterns, and in particular because they could distort the comparative advantage drivers that were supposed to be at the basis of international trade. Now, this is all well and good, but if we put this up against the interests of developing countries, and we don't have to necessarily go to the interests of countries, we can also go to the development literature that was being created around the same time that the IMF was set up, you will note that virtually all of the pioneers of development, first of all, rejected that comparative advantage was the basis of a trade policy that would allow developing countries to increase their standards of living and to increase their role in the international trading system. So the first point that we have to make is that a basic and fundamental principle that is enshrined in the Articles of Agreement of the IMF is one that is contrary to the interests of developing countries. The second is that exchange rate stability is the appropriate international exchange rate regime. Now, if we think of what is involved with exchange rate stability under a, at that time, fixed exchange rate system, we note, as Keynes also noted, that it would provide what we call an asymmetric adjustment mechanism. An asymmetric adjustment mechanism in which the developing countries are always the ones that are forced to adjust, either in terms of domestic expenditure policies, that is reductions in the domestic level of activity, or in terms of exchange rate adjustments. Now, if we look at the development strategies that were formulated at the same time by the United Nations organizations and other international organizations, the recommendation was that developing countries should be aided in their development by means of large capital inflows. Now, if we know our balance of payments accounting, it means that if you're going to have a large capital inflow in order to support the purchase of manufactured goods from developed countries, you are going to have a relatively large imbalance on your balance of trade. So that if you accept a system of international stability and exchange rates, effectively what you've done is to accept a limit, number one, on the size of the imbalance that you can run. The size of the imbalance is going to be determined, first of all, by your foreign exchange reserves, and secondly, by the necessity to apply to the IMF for funding to defend the exchange rate. Now, the help from the IMF comes with, as we all know, conditionality, and that conditionality requires that the developing countries running a deficit eliminate that deficit. So what we've done is implicitly to create a cognitive dissonance between membership by emerging market countries in a stable exchange rate regime and their own development policies. If we have asymmetric adjustment, it is always the developing countries that are going to adjust, and they're going to have to do that adjustment by giving up the development strategies that the other part of the international system, in particular the UN, is recommending them to follow. So this is the second point that I would like to make, is that perhaps instead of looking for increased quotas, the initial problem should be looking at the way the multilateral financial institutions look at international stability, in particular at international exchange rate stability. So the first point then comes in terms of external adjustments. The second, as we mentioned, that first external adjustment is usually in terms of domestic expenditure policies, that is running fiscal surpluses and running extremely tight monetary policies. The second is that under the basic approach of the IMF, remember when I was a student, we used to be taught the basic articles of agreement, and there was this thing in the IMF charter which talked about a fundamental disequilibrium, and economists used to scratch their head in trying to figure out just exactly what was a fundamental disequilibrium. Why? Well, the basic idea was that if you could declare a fundamental disequilibrium, then you would have an exchange rate adjustment. And the idea was that exchange rate adjustment would be sufficient to restore equilibrium if, in fact, the reduction in domestic income wasn't sufficient in order to bring about equilibrium in your external account. Now, if we look at exchange rate adjustment, the first thing that virtually every student learns in your course on international trade are the Marshall-Lerner conditions. Now, the Marshall-Lerner conditions deal with, well, basically they deal with elasticities of imports and exports. And if you think for a moment about these conditions, it is quite obvious that they apply to a country that has what we would call a balanced industrial structure and would have a balanced export package. That is, these are countries that are not mono-commodity producers or are not countries that rely primarily on the export of commodities solely for the foreign funds for their development. So the first point is that from very simple economic theory, the Marshall-Lerner conditions, we probably should have known that applying exchange rate adjustments to developing countries would in fact not work. Now, there's a great deal of literature in the 1960s that supports this view. In particular, I've produced the analysis by an Argentine economist, Marcel Diamand, and a Anglo-Hungarian economist Nicholas Calder, who you are probably more familiar with, both of them arguing that exchange rate adjustment, or in particular devaluations by developing countries, simply reinforce the dependence of developing countries on primary commodity exports and impede their ability to develop an industrial structure. So this is all part of the, as I said, the basic argument that that I'm attempting to make is that the basic theoretical structure that lies behind the idea of international financial stability, and in particular the current idea that we see being put forward in terms of the so-called MAP, the mutual, what is MAP? Mutual assessment, yes, the mutual assessment policy by the IMF in order to try and convince countries to run policies that will eliminate those external balances is probably fundamentally mistaken. That is, if we are going to accept any kind of development strategy that relies on external imbalances, then this will be in contradiction to the basic and fundamental principles of the IMF. Now, the last point to make is that if we look at the strategies that were recommended by the United Nations for developing countries, these were basically strategies that relied on external funding, external financing to meet what were so-called gaps or lack of domestic resources. Recently, a line of research has been developed which builds on research that already existed in the 1960s, which suggests that this in fact is a fundamentally mistaken policy. That is, that it is impossible for developing countries to develop by means of borrowing savings or borrowing finance from the developed countries. Now, this is embodied in the principle that Raul Prebisch always used, and that was that developing countries should be allowed not to borrow their way to development, but to earn their way to development. And earning their way to development meant being allowed to develop an export structure which would allow them to generate the foreign exchange which was required in order to fund a development strategy. Now, more recently, this particular point of view has come forward in an approach that has been presented by Professor Bresser, also by Professor Frenkel, in terms of looking at the impacts of external capital flows on developing countries, and in particular in terms of the impact on exchange rates. And in this particular, from this particular point of view, the exchange rate becomes a crucially important variable in development strategies, so that if we look at the idea of managing the exchange rate relative to the IMF's proposals to eliminate external balances, we once again see a cognitive dissonance. That is, the IMF strategy eliminates the possibility for developing countries to actually manage their exchange rates in the way which is most appropriate to their development in the interest of international financial stability. And this is the sort of problem we see in terms of the United States arguing, for example, that China should be willing to give up its exchange rate strategies in order to benefit U.S. workers. Now, for anybody in the United States, this seems absolutely sensible, but for anybody looking at this from the outside, effectively what you are saying is you're taking a country in which you have millions and millions of people living still on $1 or $2 a day, and you are going to sacrifice their possibility to increase their incomes to the benefit of U.S. workers. Now, on an international moral or ethical or even economic basis, this seems like complete nonsense policy, and obviously it is a non-starter. As have already been mentioned in the introduction, policies tend and still tend to be basically national rather than international, and there's absolutely no reason why China, in the interest of international stability, should be willing to give up its development strategy simply in order to eliminate an external imbalance which the United States finds disagreeable and the IMF believes causes international instability. So at that point I will conclude, having, I think, made the basic points that I wanted to make, and well, yeah, simply one last point that I would like to bring up, that relates, and this is a more technical issue. If we look at virtually all the studies that are made concerning this idea of adjustment to international imbalances and the policies to do so, you will note, and this is something that Diamand was very forceful in pointing out, that they all start from an initial position of equilibrium. That is, you start from the idea that the economy is in equilibrium, and then you apply the adjustment policy. Well, if you think about it for a minute, if you're already in equilibrium, you don't need the adjustment policy. And secondly, the basic idea is to eliminate the imbalances. So in fact, the entire theoretical basis that we normally use in traditional theory for explaining why these policies will bring about international equilibrium. In fact, what they simply do is to say they're policies that would maintain international equilibrium. Now, maintaining international equilibrium means that Brazil remains an underdeveloped country, it means that China remains an underdeveloped country, and it means that the United States remains the dominant developed country. Now, this is clearly not what we have in mind in terms of looking at the common development in the global economic system in which there is some convergence of living standards of developing countries to developed country standards. Thank you.
We go immediately to Roberto, 20 minutes.
I have prepared only one presentation, so I will read it now. Yes, my presentation title is The Challenges of Financial Globalization, asked by Ana Celia. I tried to give a very broad view of my learnings in this 35 years I've been working analyzing the working of the international financial system, particularly from the point of view of developing countries. So I start with an historical perspective. The origins of the modern financial globalization process can be traced to the second half of the 60s, when an incipient euro-dollar market was rapidly developing in London. Two events accelerated the process in the early 70s. The first was the abandonment of the fixed exchange rate regime that has applied in the Bretton Woods agreements. The change transferred currency risk to the private sector and stimulated the development of the currency and currency derivatives markets. The other early milestone was the oil price rise decided by the OPEC in 1973. The first oil shock resulted in large trade imbalances, which has to be financed. The euro-dollar market experienced a sharp rise in demand, while the surpluses of the oil exporting countries supply it with ample liquidity. So this is a starting point. Financial globalization is an historical process with two dimensions. One is the growing volume of cross-border financial transactions. The other is the sequence of institutional and legal reforms implemented to liberalize and deregulate international capital movements and national financial systems. Quantitative growth and institutional and legal changes have been mutually reinforcing. Competition in capital markets has provided a major stimulus. As deregulated international intermediaries began to provide lower-cost services, this created pressure for cost reduction and fewer regulations at the national level. The new opportunities opening up in certain countries drove deregulation of transactions between countries. International financial integration was initially mainly a developed country affair. It is notable, however, that the largest economies in Latin America were part of the globalization process from the start. First Brazil in the late 60s, and then Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, and Chile were large recipients of capital in the 1970s. These last two countries, I mean Argentina and Chile, along with Uruguay, they pioneered drastic liberalizing reforms which anticipated those that were to be applied so widely in the 1990s. The participation of Latin America in financial globalization was interrupted by the debt crisis of the 1980s. This caused a hiatus of about 8 years, during which voluntary financing dried up for Latin America and the process at the international level decelerated. Then in the 1990s, the region re-entered the process vigorously, carrying out drastic reforms and becoming a recipient of growing flows of capital. At the same time, the financial globalization accelerated again and was extended geographically, mainly to the former socialist countries and to East Asian economies. Developing countries participated in the process were then called emerging markets, and their financial assets have constituted since then a well-defined class in the portfolios of specialized agents. Financial globalization did not yield the results expected by its promoters. At the beginning of the 2000s, let us say in 2002, the insertion of the emerging market economies into the global financial system that had been evolving since the 60s seemed to have turned into a burden for economic growth and a source of instability. There was little room for optimism with respect to the prospect of those countries. 5 main starlight facts supported this view. First, financial and currency crises in emerging market economies were increasingly frequent and intense. Considering only the main episodes since the early 90s, the sequence encompassed the cases of Mexico and Argentina in 1985, the 5 East Asian economies in 1997-1998, Russia and Brazil in 1998-1999, and Argentina, Uruguay, and Turkey in 2001. Even the most favorable observers of the financial globalization process, like the managing directors of the IMF at that time, assumed that the continuity of that trend and the emergence of new crises in emerging market economies as an intrinsic characteristic of the new global financial system. Second, there was striking evidence on the volatility of capital flows and the propensity to international contagion. These characteristics were first observed with the repercussions of the Mexican crisis in 1995 and gained wide recognition with the strong global financial impacts of the Asian and Russian crisis. Third, there was the extreme cases of highly indebted countries like Argentina and Brazil, and this situation weighed heavily in the diagnosis. At the end of the 90s, both economies, Argentina and Brazil, were locked in financial trap situations, with high country risk premiums, slow growth in the case of Brazil, recession in the case of Argentina, and great external financial fragility. The Argentine crisis erupted in 2001 and was followed by the default of the external debt. Brazil had experienced the currency crisis in 1998-1999 without defaulting on its external debt. However, even though the Brazilian exchange rate policy became more flexible after the episode, the economic policy and economic performance was still locked in a financial trap at the beginning of the 2000s. Fourth, most of the emerging market economies seem to have entered into the global financial system in a segmented form. The phenomenon was evident in the highly indebted countries like Argentina and Brazil, I mentioned. However, several emerging market countries that had managed their policy in order to avoid high debts and financial traps also experienced a segmented integration. After participating in the financial globalization process for a long time, almost 3 decades in the case of Latin American economies, their financial assets constituted a class of assets whose yields include a considerable country risk premium. The country risk premium had reached a minimum level in 1997, just before the devaluation in Thailand took place. But since then, the country risk premiums have increased, and they were still high at the beginning of the 2000s. Hence, given that the sum of the risk-free international rate plus the country risk premium sets the floor for domestic interest rates, the financial integration seems to have condemned emerging market economy to systematically higher rates than those of the developed countries, with negative consequences on growth and income distribution. Fifth, there was a reversal of the initiative for international coordination that had followed the crisis of the late 90s. At that time, some initiatives were taken in order to improve the so-called international financial architecture, to reduce volatility and contagion, to prevent crises, and to improve the international management of the potential future crisis. However, since 2001, the new Republican United States administration and the novel authorities of the IMF have held the perspective that the very existence of multilateral support mechanisms set incentive for over-indebtedness and increase the probability of crisis. At the same time, the IMF began to work on the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. But this initiative, originally suggested by the new United States administration, was abandoned sometime after. Simultaneously, the interest in the international financial architecture also fainted. By the early 2000s, the stability of the international financial linkages of emerging markets became more reliant on the spontaneous behavior of the markets than even before. In sum, far from achieving the promise of greater stability and growth formulated by the promoters of financial liberalization and opening, the process of financial globalization seems to have resulted for most emerging market economies in a new source of volatility and a burden for growth. In order to deal with the volatility that resulted from financial globalization, these countries had to implement their own preventive and defensive measures without the support, and in many cases, even against the orientation of the multilateral financial institutions. As already mentioned, these circumstances did not leave much room for optimism. By that time, I attempt to synthesize the difficulties confronted by emerging market economy as follows. Quoting, a country that intends to implement capital market and capital account regulations to avoid an unsustainable financial integration path has to confront with the IMF and the pressure of international financial market. It is a difficult task, but some countries have managed to do it. With regard to this issue, the target is well defined. We should put our efforts into promoting the appropriate changes in the rules and conditionality of the IMF and other multilateral institutions. In contrast, without an important effort of international cooperation, it's difficult to find ways out of the highly indebted emerging market country situation, and more generally, to establish an institutional context capable of neutralizing the segmentic integration. The essence of the problem lies in that there is an inconsistency between the nation states and the international financial system that lacks most of the institutions that have developed over time at national system to improve their stability and the way they work. End of quoting. My diagnosis at that time was not wrong, given the evidence we had in 2002, but the pessimism was not justified a posteriori. Actually, in the following years, the countries found unforeseen ways to avoid unsustainable path and high debt financial trap without confronting with the IMF. And on the other hand, the expectation of emerging market assets almost vanished in the following years without any improvement in the international institutional setting. So I would talk about unforeseen, at least for me, novel trends. The novel trends has been associated with a remarkable change in emerging market economies, financial integration, and in the global system. In particular, the fact that developing countries started to become less dependent on foreign savings and that many of them actually became net supplier of savings. This change started to become apparent in 2002 and more clearly from 2003 onwards. The changes of the global financial system with respect to the previous trend are well represented by two facts. First, there were no new crises in emerging market economy in spite of the emerging of various episodes of financial turmoil with contagion effects in the following years. Remarkably, the subprime crisis in the United States did not trigger financial crisis in any emerging market economy. Second, country risk premiums have followed a declining trend since early 2003, and from mid-2005, they fell below the minimum value registered in the pre-Asian crisis period. In early 2007, country risk premium reached their historical minimum, significantly lower than the minimum level of the pre-Asian crisis period and also significantly lower than the spread of the United States high-yield bonds. The country risk premiums rose after the subprime crisis, but even in the worst moments of the recent period, the emerging market risk premiums were similar to the best moments of the pre-Asian crisis period. Finally, it should be mentioned that simultaneously with these two developments in the global financial system, it has been also observed a substantial acceleration of developing countries' growth rate. These changes have been associated with novel features in developing economies in the 2000s. In comparison with the previous 30 years of financial globalization, both regarding the modalities of international financial insertion and the implemented macroeconomic policy regimes. The most striking novel features are as follows. First, the generation of current account surpluses or the significant reduction of deficit in many leading developing economies, whose overall result was a reversal of the direction of net capital flows between developed and developing countries that characterized the 30 previous years. This new configuration of current account results persisted after the global crisis. Second, the accumulation of large reserves in many developing countries. This feature also persisted after the global crisis. Third, many economies adopted flexible exchange rate regimes with varying degrees of administration by the monetary authorities. In fact, there has been a significant reduction in the risk of financial stability in developing countries. Indeed, current account surpluses and foreign reserves are bulky external robustness indicators. In the 2000s, the class of emerging market assets became more heterogeneous, and many of these assets correspond to robust economies. This helped to dispel the segmentation of emerging market assets and significantly reduce the risk of contagion and herd behavior with respect to this class of assets, so that the reduction of risk was also extended to developing countries which continue showing current account deficit or did not make their exchange rate regimes more flexible. The managed floating exchange regime allows the monetary authority to intervene in the foreign exchange market to prevent or mitigate the appreciation trends and accumulate reserves when the conditions of the current account and or capital inflows lead to selling pressures in the exchange market. This was the case in many emerging market countries after the Asian crisis, particularly in the period 2002-2008. The availability of reserves reduced the risk of default on public and private debt due to insufficient international liquidity under any exchange rate regime. But the combination of abundant reserve and managed floating tends to reduce risk by other means. For instance, faced with a negative external shock like in 2008, exchange rate flexibility leads to exchange rate depreciation, thus contributing to the economy's adjustment to changing external conditions. In such a case, the availability of reserve allows the selling intervention to control and prevent overshooting and the formation, to control the devaluation and prevent overshooting and the formation of self-fulfilling bubbles in the exchange market. This limits the negative balance sheet effects on banks and firms, particularly in an economy with partially dollarized financial system. In this context, the exhibition of large reserves gives greater strength to the central bank's ability to guide the foreign exchange market, and consequently large-scale selling interventions may not be required. Lessons from financial crisis. The period between the mid-70s and the covers a range of crises. This I wrote that thinking of the students of this course. The period between the mid-70s and 2000 covers a range of crises that provide rich material for the analysis of the phenomenon. The analysis of the common features of the crisis provides clear lessons on their causes. Consequently, the conclusion of the study of the set of cases suggests policy to prevent crises and to mitigate their effect and facilitate their resolution once they occur. Overall, the crisis in developing countries and the more recent crisis in developed economies have highlighted the shortcomings of poorly regulated domestic financial systems. The general lesson is that reinforcing and extending financial regulation is essential to avoid instability and crisis. However, a specific conclusion from the study of developing countries is that the prevention of crisis in this economy involves elements that go beyond the regulation of the domestic financial system. In developing economies, the conjunction of macroeconomic policy with the modality of insertion into the international financial system plays a crucial role in the financial performance. Consequently, crisis prevention in this country also requires consistent macroeconomic configuration with the exchange rate policy, and the policy related to the management of the balance of payments and international reserve are crucial components. In summary, the study of crisis in developing countries suggests that in addition to strengthening and expand financial regulation, countries should adopt exchange rate regimes, providing flexibility to policymakers and preventing speculation. Second, implement measures pointing to the regulation of capital flows. And third, implement policies that ensure the robustness of the external accounts, including the accumulation of international reserves and the preservation of competitive or non-appreciated real exchange rate. The changes observed in many developing countries in the 2000s are consistent with the prevention measures suggested by the above lessons. So, it can be concluded that the robustness exhibited recently by developing economies can be seen as a posteriori confirmation of the recommendation derived from those lessons. Conclusions. It is striking that the mentioned facts have little recognition by the multilateral financial institutions. Even without recognizing the role played by the new macroeconomic settings in the growth acceleration in developing countries in the 2000s, multilateral institutions can hardly ignore the positive effects that the innovation have had on the relations between developing countries and the international financial system. It should be accepted at least that the new context largely relieved the most negative traits that financial globalization showed at the end of the 90s. But the official doctrine of the international financial institutions does not register those facts. Neither has been systemized and discussed in our own countries the rich experience of developing countries with financial globalization. We are losing a valuable source of knowledge and policy lessons that should be an essential part of the basis for the formation of policymakers and for the further development of research on this subject. Bachmonte have read this paper and told me why you became an optimistic. Well, sometimes leftists can be optimistic also, but putting this aside, I optimistic regarding financial instability. It doesn't mean that I'm optimistic regarding everything that happened in the developing country. Particularly, I'm much more worried about Dutch disease and exchange rate appreciation because of capital inflows in our countries than worried about the risk of crisis of the type we have suffered in the first 30 years of financial globalization. Thank you.
We are going to have the three comments. We will begin with Luis Carlos, 15 minutes, please. Você tem que yes.
Yes, international finance. I am persuaded that since the 70s, international finance is the fundamental form through which rich countries essay and try to explore developing countries. The other explore, no?
Yeah.
Exploit developing countries. There is a way they transfer existing and potential economic surplus from developing to rich countries. The previous form was trade, was unequal trade. But since these nasty developing countries learned something about Prebisch and Furtado and began to industrialize, or learn from experience of Japan, for instance, before. They tried to industrialize, protect the industries, etc. And then came the second alternative. And the second alternative was finance. And for finance, what was essential to legitimize finance, to have finance, international finance, what you need fundamentally and always is an overvalued exchange rate. So an overvalued exchange rate became fully legitimized. I have a whole theory that I cannot, about the tendency to the chronic and cyclical overvaluation of the exchange rate in developing countries. But what's important is that what you are really legitimizing was finance, that is current account deficits. And in the moment that you decide to have current account deficits, you are deciding to have an overvalued currency, by definition. Then this made a perfect circle. No? Because now we need foreign finance. We dramatically need foreign finance because we have, and for this we Latin America, structuralist economists, who helped a lot the empire because we came with the foreign constraint, something that exists. There is a foreign constraint based on the classical elasticities, especially our import elasticity bigger than 1. But from this fact came a policy. So how to overcome the foreign constraint? Very simple, by borrowing. Not, which would be the alternative? Put the exchange rate in the right place. No. That's borrowing. And when you borrow, you made the exchange rate still more overvalued. Well, so, and then direct investment was legitimized, finance was legitimized, everything was, development became a competition among developing countries to be which one would get more direct investments and foreign finance in general. This was the neoliberal years. Well, this led to small growth and financial crisis. In all this, the exchange rate is the fundamental thing. And to manage the exchange rate is the fundamental thing. It's the fundamental price that rich countries, neoliberal, neoclassical economists don't like at all. And I am going to profit this short moment to tell you the last thing that I learned about this. What was the last thing? Because you know that for years I have been saying that one of the causes of this overvalued currencies is the Dutch disease. The other are the excessive, unnecessary capital inflows to finance growth, etc. But the Dutch disease. Then, and I said, well, and given the Dutch disease, the solution for the neutralize the Dutch disease and putting the exchange rate in the industrial equilibrium, keeping out of the current equilibrium, is a tax on exports, like the Argentinians have. It's not only this, but this is essential. Well, and I think people had difficulty understanding what I was saying. And in last October, I went to Berlin. And there I found a very good economist called Jan Priv. And I was talking with him, and he said, no. Very interesting, your theory of two exchange rate equilibriums, the industrial and the current. But your story about neutralize the Dutch disease by a tax, this makes no sense. Then he came to Brazil. I invited him to come to Brazil in January, and he came and continued to say that. I tried to persuade him, nothing. Then he sent me a German note, 3 pages, single space, arguing that I was wrong. I was thinking. And then I came to a thing that maybe is very important to help to understand the exchange rate and to orient policy. I came to the concept of the value of the exchange rate. Well, there is a value for this pen. There is a value for this. There is a value for every goods and services. Which is the value? Well, this, I know that is outmoded, but the value is the labor theory value, or more practically, is the cost plus reasonable profit of the efficient firms producing this pen, producing this paper, etc. This is the value. And given this value, the price will fluctuate around the value according to fluctuations in the demand and supply of that commodity or of that service. Well, this I learned when I was very young, almost forgot. But why not to use this to the exchange rate? Why don't, it's a price also. There is a market price, the price of foreign monies. Okay, why cannot have also, if it's a price, it should have a value. Which is the value of the exchange rate? The value of the exchange is the cost plus reasonable profit of the efficient business firms, or of the representative business firms in your country. This is the value of the exchange rate. In my model of the Dutch disease, then the when I put there the equilibrium, the current equilibrium and the industrial equilibrium, these are value concepts. Because I have also the price that in the model fluctuates around the current equilibrium. But in the case of Dutch disease, you have two values. The value for the commodities that benefit from Ricardian rents, and so can be exported at exchange rate plus more appreciated than the ones that you use, are necessary, are required for the manufacturing industries or the tradable industries that utilize technology in the state of the art to be also competitive. So these are two value, not price. And then I got my answer from my friend Priv. Because in the moment that I put a tax on the commodity, if in Brazil, for instance, only soybeans were the cause of the Dutch disease, to simplify, and the current equilibrium is 210 and the industrial 275 reais per dollar. If I put 65 cents of reais as a tax on the exports of soybeans, the cost plus reasonable profit of soybeans will go up and became equal to the industrial equilibrium, and the Dutch disease will be neutralized. Because I changed the value of the exchange rate for this. So I tell you this because we have to have equilibrium exchange rate. They say now this is mercantilism, this is currency wars and things like that. Oh, there is a fact that you have to have exchange rate equilibrium. And the problem that you have in Brazil, for instance, in the moment that you have Dutch disease, you don't need foreign finance, because you are supposed to have a current account surplus when you move from the current to the industrial equilibrium through the profit, through the tax. But you say, but I can still want to have foreign savings, because I want to have foreign savings to add the foreign savings to the domestic savings and to increase the investment rate. Okay, you want. But what you know is that you have a very high rate of substitution of foreign for domestic savings. Why? Because in the moment that you decide to grow with foreign savings, you are deciding to grow, to overvalue your currency. In the moment that you are deciding to overvalue your currency, you are deciding to limit the investment opportunities of businessmen that are efficient and competitive. So you are reducing the investment rate. And if you are Keynesians, you remember that when you reduce the investment, you are reducing the savings rate. So I think that this problem of foreign financing is a fully different approach. And I think that the two presentations that were made originally are very clearly on this direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis Carlos. Now, Gary, 15 minutes.
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, talking about what I hope will be a sustained and continuing global initiative. Is this thing okay? Yeah. All right. I want to kind of bring in some perspectives that are implicit in what's been talked about, but in some sense, like my contributions to the several workshops that I've participated in over time, highlight more of the behavioral micro-foundational aspects. I'm going to pick up from Jan's advice. I like the way that you entered in and said, one point is to think about what value added can this initiative provide. Secondly, how can we maintain an emphasis on middle income developing countries and their role in this global evolving situation. And then thirdly, how we can connect together in doing this. That last point, I think, will be the topic more of tomorrow's conversation about how this we can institutionalize this. And so save those comments. But today, really thinking about what's missing in current debates and what can be added in, following on the spirit of what Jan and Roberto and Bresser have given us. I want to talk about first something that is, I think, has to be on the agenda as an object of study and consideration for this new initiative. And this is going to be, we're going to look first at the kind of the yin and then the yang. The yin is going to be the problem of power and finance. And then the yang is going to be taking a look at the need to renew the space for democratic and growth-oriented credit flows and what we can learn from the experience of developing countries in particular. And then thirdly, I'll just touch back on something that Jan mentioned, that is the problem of international economic coordination. But let's go with the first one first, the problem of power and finance. The thing I would want to bring up as, and we talk about, let's say, the behavioral and institutional dimensions of finance, the firms that are in one case bringing in unstable financial flows, and on the other hand, sitting at the center of Wall Street and City of London and so on, are basically now, in some sense, at the very moment of their triumph of having dominated the globalization, the process of globalization itself, and pushed national governments into the corner. At that very moment of triumph, of course, they've shown that they've brought us to nothing short of a dysfunctional conjuncture. We have these increasingly powerful and ambitious mega banks that required plentiful liquidity and a scope for operation that pushed, as Jan mentioned, us into deregulation and so on, and this came up in Roberto's as well, and that basically made this space for themselves. Now, and those institutions have not disappeared. They are laying off, they're re-gearing, they're rethinking, they're controlling their bonuses, maybe, they're cutting divisions, they're reducing their branches in Panama or something like that. There are all these adjustments being made, but the fundamental idea that the world is their oyster has not been surrendered. And furthermore, that this is what banking is. And that's the thing I think, that what banking and finance is something that's been at the heart of the agenda that you've put forward, and that's something that we cannot surrender. The idea that we now have bank branches that are sales outlets for basically financial services, including loans, but that are not necessarily sites of information-intensive activity that rewards the deserving small businesses and capacitates them for either exchange or for exportation. That is something that's lost. The fact that these mega banks are feeding hedge funds and private equity funds is another part of it, and that the consequence of letting these unchained institutions continue is basically that we'll have more pro-cyclical speculation and behavior. We'll continue to have the over-leveraging and risk-shifting, and bystanders will be pulled in. It is true that Brazil and the BRICS were not pulled into the global crisis, but it is also true that Europe was. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. It wasn't that there were so much the flows of credit that directly from the U.S. subprime market into Europe, but it was that imitative behavior required and the pursuit of profits by the mega banks and their desire, the Deutsche Banks and others, to be at the first tier of the global system, basically forced these changes, forced Europe into crisis. And this had to do with the reinstitutionalization and the redefinition of what a bank is, not so much even with the flows. And of course, this goes along with market segmentation, which you've emphasized. Let me just say that what we have is a system in which there's been an assertion of power that has to do with, first, the breaking of the financial process into what was called by Sanford, actually the then CEO of Bankers Trust in 1993 at it was the Wyoming conference. He called it particle finance. We break finance into particles, and kind of following Chaim Minsky's old adage that what can be securitized will be securitized. Basically, we have this disintegration of the financial processes into parts, and the parts are all priced separately, and as we know, we were supposed to enter an efficient market wonderland. And the thing is that once this occurs, then the old-fashioned integrated circuits basically become seen as sort of dinosauric, And indeed, there's a kind of gravitational pull of these new circuits that leads us toward the idea that, well, if we maintain these privileged circuits, they must be somehow special, and they must require protection. And maybe that's a bad thing, that's a sign of weakness. And so this goes against the very idea. We've talked about some of the pioneers of development today, and part of the idea is to build and invest in and believe in institutions that can grow your national power. And it's these that, of course, are obstacles. And when we look at, Robert's work is shown, when we look at what happened in the wake of the East Asian crisis, we destroy those things because that's actually an obstacle to the terrain of power of this new presence. I'll just mention that there are many sources of power, but I would point to the fact that with this new model, the originate and distribute lending model, what we have is the replacement of the idea of the bank as lender with the idea as the bank as a coordinator of a network of services, and which has become necessary because it is the orchestrator. It no longer bears the risk, it shifts the risk, it does all that, but it's at the center of this kind of crazy circle to which you need access if you're going to try to get a loan, with no guarantees, of course. And there's the banks at the center of this nexus are basically protected by their asymmetric resilience, the fact that they are too big to fail or too big to save, and sit there at the center of power. Now, what I want to just mention then is that the Eurozone crisis points out the huge problems that come from this system, and the fact that the Eurozone itself, the mechanisms, the construction of central banks, of banking authorities, that is, you're nationally responsible. There's a central bank that's there, but you can't really appeal to it. It's not really available to solve any crisis. It really shows the problems that arise when you have globally ambitious mega banks that are able to compete fiercely in country spaces where there is no ability to perform lender of last resort protection for them, and where the consequence, as we see here, is literally the destruction of government capacity in the arguably second largest economic zone in the world. And so this is something that has to be avoided. We have this situation where government is put into a corner where when the crisis inevitably comes, and the crisis comes because these banks have balance sheets bigger than the GDPs of these nations. There's no capacity to save them, but there's no capacity to do anything else except to have a government sector that now has to keep alive, essentially, these Frankensteinian mechanisms for profit extraction and rent extraction that really produce almost no useful credit for growing economies. Now, Brazil, India, China, I think they're presented with a choice. Part of what we see, and let's keep in mind that just a couple of years ago, the highest investment banking salaries in the world were being paid in Sao Paulo, as there was this kind of buzz, right, that Sao Paulo was going to be the place. And, that's something that, again, has to do, as we know, with the institutional reorganization of banking, independent of, and of course, interrelated with the financial flows. And that's something that has to be kept in mind, because Brazil avoided the entanglement in the global financial crisis for several reasons. One is that its own banks were focused on the growing, if fragile, credit markets and opportunities here nationally. Secondly, there were rules about cross-border capital movements, and there was a tight control of market conditions and exchanges by the authorities here. The same thing, of course, would be true of China. India, with some ambivalence and different kinds of pressures, true there as well, made kind of at a different point, but it avoided being sucked in. However, the pressures for liberalization in India, for liberalization in Brazil and China are there in different ways. Now, on the other side, on this topic 2, which is to flip from the power problem to the credit flow problem and the, let's say, growth-inducing and credit flows, we have to keep in mind that one of the things that's been very special about Brazil's development path, especially, is the power and the sort of wisdom of the BNDES model. Now, I know that BNDES itself is a political entity There are debates all the time about the different things that BNDES does or doesn't do, the social agenda versus the small and medium enterprise agenda, the use of Brazil, even the forcing of Brazil into provision of trade credit by some partners as we move through this complex landscape of trying to maintain, kind of a positive balance with partners who are themselves selfish and self-motivated, even if they are BRICS. It is what it is. It's a jungle out there, as Jan mentioned. That said, so we don't see BNDES innocently, but we have to say that small and medium enterprises receive some credit in this country for that reason. We also know that there's complaints about the fact that too much of the credit is provided by BNDES. It's an example of the shackles in the private market and so on. We know those debates are out there, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind that this is an institution that's a public institution that receives significant support, that has the capacity and the ability to make national investment strategies happen. And essentially, this is important. And I would contrast this with something Jan and I were talking about and at the Levy Institute last summer, the fate of the Community Development Financial Institution Program in the U.S., which is operated as a toy program without scale and without the capacity to change a thing about the wealth and poverty extremes in the underdeveloped portions of the United States. So, I would just say that this is something, the teaching of this is something that we have to keep in mind. The emphasis on this, and this means really being realistic about and renewing a commitment to an understanding of even what banking is. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. I would, of course, make the same kinds of comments about microfinance. We need to think of a world of jobs more than a world of entrepreneurs without capital. And let me just go then to touch briefly on the final point, the problem of international economic coordination, yet again, brought up by Jan. I would just make a couple of points here. First of all, linking to the global power and finance problem, effective global governance in finance is going to be something that will arise when there are no offshore solutions. Your point about the central banker that highlighted his ability to say no is problematic. Central banks are clubs indeed, and they protect basically those they can protect. The coming of Secretary Lew as Treasury Secretary representing Wall Street again in the United States is just another symbol of that, without really any opposition at all by a very compliant Congress. So, we have to think of this as something, again, that requires attention by Spider, so that the next generation of students doesn't forget what the options really are. And I would just mention that I was recently at an INET-funded conference where essentially it was argued that the Federal Reserve has become a dealer of last resort, and that's not problematic. I think it is problematic because essentially that means that all that we want from our central banks is to feed the liquidity machine, which is essentially what that mega bank complex needs to maintain its kind of Frankensteinian pace around the world, which otherwise will see its governmental capacity squeezed ever more without the capacity to really put in place and to finance policies for growth. I'm stop right there, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Gary. So the last presentations, Rogério, up to 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you for the invitation. And it's really difficult to follow. I was talking to Gary, who is a good friend, and he said, you should be the last speak before to respond to what Ian is going to say about the multilateral institutions. And then I thought, oh my gosh, I'm seen as a representative of imperialism that I have to get. I said, no, Gary, give me the last word, because imperialism always has the last say. But but let me say that the richness of the discussion here is that clearly, from our perspective, we can see that the multilateral or the international, the multilateral system is failing developing countries, particularly the international financial architecture. But we also see from what Gary has said, the domestic financial architecture is failing many developing countries. I agree with most of the analysis, and Ian, I agree completely with what you said. I only have one caveat to that. It has to do with my experience, and probably with many others. Power does not shift by divine grace or the willingness of those. You said, you know, it's clear that the systems, the international financial architecture is dysfunctional. But you said in talking about China, you asked the question, why should China give up the space that they have for the domestic policies in order to guarantee international stability? As a progressive multilateralist, I would say they should, because there's one lesson that we have learned in this many years, is that the international community cannot, but in a coordinated way, face the many challenges that we have, from poverty alleviation to climate change to financial crisis. But this is my belief, this is our belief. It's not how it happens. As a matter of fact, I keep joking with my Chinese colleague at the World Bank that China has invented the time machine. They sit down and wait. Because the only way for you to achieve leverage in the international community is by gaining strength in the domestic space, as being strong economy, strong nation, and this is, of course, it goes beyond the economy, but also has to do with the nation's politics. So therefore, I think that not the pragmatic, but I hate to say realism, because realism is always what one sees. But from my perspective, the realistic approach to this is that the only way the developing countries can increase the capacity to influence the international, any international forum, is by reinforcing its domestic development, both economic, political, and many levels. So I think that, and I will have to say that we observed that, I myself observed it. I had the privilege to observe that personally, for instance, in the creation of the G20 as a leaders forum. Basically, when there was a clear idea from developed countries that the crisis that we had in front of us could not be addressed without coordinated actions, they said, well, let's work together now. Okay, of course there has been change because, as I said, power is difficult to shift and to be handled, so they go back and forth. But as I said, for instance, it's by no chance that, for instance, China had a chief economist, a Chinese chief economist, the World Bank, might have the head of the IFC, the private sector wing of the World Bank, as a significant player. And also, I can tell you from the works of the boards and so on that the role of BRICS, but particularly of China, has increased significantly. Now, the point that I wanted to make here, the only small contribution that I have, if I have any, because Gary has already said that, in a much better way, is that we have to earn the way to develop, and the way to do that is to create appropriate policy regimes, but also institutions that can not only anchor but leverage development. Okay. For instance, we all know that developed countries, my good friend Ha-Joon Cheng has been saying this for years, but many of us have been saying, Robert has been saying for years, have used all kinds of industrial policies in order to create the institutions that we call industries and so on, that are the pillars of their own development. And this is, again, even the World Bank, that has been one of the most conservative, or to say the least, against industrial policies, now fully recognize that. The fact that Justin Lin was the chief economist has to do with that, and I can tell you that it has become common to even say the word industrial policy in the World Bank, in an IMF. I would say that in the IMF, some of the works of the IMF are much more advanced when talking about industrial policy than the World Bank, surprisingly. And I think that has to do with the fact that the World Bank is asymmetric by definition. It prescribes policies for developing countries, and they'll say, well, okay, we can do industrial policies, but maybe you should think about it, okay? So in building appropriate policy regimes and institutions is important. I just want to, building on what Justin said, there's one thing that I see missing in the discussion from the issue of building institutions that is very dear to me is the issue of policies to develop financial instruments, domestic financial instruments for development. There's an interesting thing that came out, the two reports that came out from the World Bank. One, it's on financial sector development from some people that have been for a long time defending financial liberalization. The other one has come out from the operational lack region on financial sector development in Latin America. The two are very interesting to read just to notice this. The first one makes a mea culpa to say, you know what, maybe some of the financial liberalization reforms that we proposed for so many years was not so good. Notice what happens when we try to apply that to developed countries. Of course, they're a little bit embarrassed. We knew that, particularly us that have been working on the issue for many years, because we saw the damage that they caused to developing countries. Actually, we wrote about it extensively, and we warned about this possibility. But of course, when it happens to developed countries, hey, maybe we should look at it. But they say, this first report, they do a mea culpa, but they say, but take it easy. The name of the report is The Role of the State. And they say, but, don't go that far. I mean, if the state starts to intervene, then you're going to have all kinds of distortions. And be careful. You have to enable the private sector to develop, but do not, enable, but do not touch it. Okay? The second one is much more pragmatic. And it goes beyond, still a little bit timid, by saying, you know what, there's something strange going on in Latin America. We have been the region that has been following the most of the financial liberalization reforms, also what we call nowadays the Washington Consensus, but we have been very good students. We have advanced all kinds of reforms. We have one of the shallowest, most risk-averse and rent-sinking financial sectors of many of the regions, particularly if you compare to Asia, it's quite astonishing. And even when you look at financial deepening, if you go deep into financial deepening, you're going to see that all the instruments and the finance are concentrated in the short term. I would go even a little bit further. This is an interesting, very interesting study. They're putting together another book about development banks, because they say, after all, development banks helped a lot in Latin America. To say that in the World Bank, you can imagine. You have to be very careful. You have to have 250 hands. So on the one hand, on the other hand, there's a third hand. But they do it, and they are putting together. A book on development banks, which basically says that maybe those guys are right, and development banks should we should look at they work well, they are functional, and so on. No. But there's one thing that bothers me quite a lot from our own camp. From the conservative side, when we talk about financial sector, basically what they're going to say is a laissez-faire recipe. Don't touch it. If you touch it, it's just to deregulate and so on. From our side, I think there's little said about, except for instance, what Gary has been doing, about what to do in order to develop a domestic financial instrument. When you even mention market institutions, then you should. I find it interesting. We know that industry refers to any sector that is a pillar of growth and development. A financial industry is one of the most important pillars to sustain development. The Asians know about that. I mean, I remember my friend Hajun Cheng when I was reading about East Asia, and I said, gosh, I mean, you guys intervene so much. I mean, South Korea, I mean, your capacity to intervene directly in sources and allocation of finance is incredible. But at the same time, you've been talking about financial liberalization for years. And when you joined the OECD, I said, Rogerio, one thing is what we say. The other thing is what we do. We know this is too important to say and do. In Latin America, we've chosen a different path. But there's something missing there, is our capacity, what I would call, to develop an industrial policy for the financial sector. which means it's to using, for instance, all the not only the enabling markets. And I'm glad that Hernani was here. I wouldn't say he's gone, but Hernani was here because this is a concern that we have here in Brazil. It's using not only the policy space, but the instruments that we have in order to leverage the creations of institutions and markets. Now, from our point of view, why do you think, I suspect we have so much, we do not do a lot of research about that? It's because I have 2 minutes. No, I have 3.5. I'm counting.
Here's the official clock. It's the World Bank clock here.
No. No, you take it 30 seconds, so I'm going to put it back here. Now, I think that the reason for that, the reason for that is not only ideological. The reason for that is that one of the dominant views that we have had after Stiglitz and all is the issue of market failures, which are seen as a structure to the system. When you have a structural problem you cannot overcome with policy, therefore what you do is, well, there's nothing we can do, so we have development banks. What is the problem about that kind of analysis? Is that in developing countries, when the demands for investment in social infrastructure and so on are so significant, there is no way, and particularly in market economies, with China is different, Asian countries in some countries is different, but to have the capacity to provide all the financing needs is just so overwhelming. And we see that in the experience of Brazil has got one of the best development banks and all the development banks, but we are reaching our limits. Yeah. So the only little contribution that I want to do that, and Fernando, I think I'm going to conclude within my 15 minutes, is to say this. First, Ian, I think that the only way, I mean, that's this idea that first that we have the wrong strategy. It's not a question of whatever strategy we have, the only strategy for us to achieve any relevance and say is by increasing our capacity to develop and create a dynamism in our own economy. I think we're doing some progress, but not as much as we wished. Second, I think that one of the main constraints, particularly when it comes to Latin America and the Caribbean in development, has to do with how we address the financial sector. The financial sector in the whole region has become, as I said, shallow in many places, deep in others, but mainly a short-termist and rent-seeking. This has permeated the whole industrial sector. Entrepreneurs, and I say that I should just use a figure that you understand, they can wait. Anytime they can wait. Because if they don't do the investments in technology, in innovation, and so on, they know that they can put the money somewhere and they're going to make significant amount of money out of that. So this is how to break with this by creating institutions. Of course, you have to have the policy space, but you have to have enormous investment in further policy. So I just want to conclude that I have come to believe that we really need, and I leave that to the appropriate space, we really need to have more studies towards what I call industrial policy, towards a functional financial sectors for developing countries. And this is one thing that in case of the region is of utmost importance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rogério. Ana asked me to make a very quick wrap-up of what we discussed in this first session. And I would like just actually to stress that there was a very high degree of convergence among all the presentations. And in a sense, voluntarily or consciously or not, what we had here is the proposal of a research agenda for the web. So I would just like to call the attention to some of the, at least they seem to me, the key proposals for this research agenda, which seem to turn around the general theme of the role of national states and policy autonomy under the current conditions of globalization. This, of course, is an old discussion, but it has some new aspects, and I think most of the presentations emphasized the need to explore these new aspects. Well, of course, the first issue is, it was common to most presentations, is the need, yet again, to think again about exchange rates. As Jan was raising, even in theoretical terms, the theoretical fundamental models and ways of approaching the question, but of course the policy problems beyond the currency wars that are very much in evidence now. But in this country, I arrived here 3 days ago, but this seems to be the discussion everywhere, if how far exchange rates should be used as an instrument against inflation, to control inflation, even at the price, for instance, of making Dutch disease problems even worse. So it's obvious that there is something missing with the theory here. It's not just a question of policy, but there are too many demands on this instrument, and it's not always clear how do you do, what should you do to make them compatible. The second, so the first one is exchange rates in themselves. This is a field that should concentrate a lot of attention. The second one, I think was mostly raised by Jan, but also by Rogério, is the question of international coordination. After the crisis in particular, there was this enlargement of many institutions, the BIS, the G20, the Basel Committee, the Financial Stability Board, that they absorbed many of the developing countries, particularly the ones that had been demanding, until then at least, to have a stronger voice for developing countries, but are sometimes happy that they themselves got this voice. And I would just like to emphasize, and this is very clear not only in the history, but also in the performance, for instance, of the G20, but also in the Basel Committee and so on, that all these institutions actually were in existence before the crisis, and they were created to preserve, to manage, not to transform. So even since the first meeting of the G20 after, at the end of 2008, the meeting called by then President Bush, when you see the communiques, you see that the intention is to preserve, is not really to change anything important. On the other hand, this is the game that is being played. So you have always the discussion, and I think this is perhaps the theme to be explored, how far it is possible or even desirable to go alone, which in the past was possible, against the attempts to change institutions and to participate at the cost of accepting rules that perhaps preclude any kind of change. I will just give one example that I think is a very interesting example, is the view of the IMF on capital controls. Everybody is very impressed with that Blanchard finally saw that capital controls were not that bad under very strict conditions, but it's not equally stressed that the IMF insists that this should be done with the authorization of the IMF, that this is part of an international concern with stability. So capital controls is okay, but you have to get the authorization, which is against, by the way, the spirit of Article 6 of the Articles of Agreement of the IMF. But this kind of things, how far you get autonomy and what you pay for this autonomy when you accept some rules, I think it's a very interesting issue to study. Related to this, there is a third theme that was also mentioned quickly by Jan, when he mentioned that the roots of the current international rules, financial rules, were the support for free trade. And this is, I think, very important, but it's also very important to investigate how far the concept of free trade changed in these decades. Because free trade used to be trade of goods, basically, and nowadays it's mostly trade of assets. And this is the part that is usually invisible. You have rules about investments, for instance, that constrain the autonomy of individual countries to regulate this, to impose limits. Argentina is now facing pressures from all sides. So free trade is an important issue in itself, but it's particularly important because under the label free trade nowadays, we have a much larger number of issues. The fourth theme that was raised here, and I think Roberto insisted on this a lot, is the question of systemic safety. Not only the domestic systemic safety, the banking crisis, but balance of payments safety. For instance, how far the accumulation of reserves actually make the situation safer, how stable are those reserves, how far can you actually count then on a crisis that, for instance, eventually in the future is originated in the emerging countries or developing countries. To some extent, the 2008 crisis, the developing countries, the investors or the wealth holders in these countries didn't have any place to escape, actually. It was much better to stay in the emerging countries than go into Europe or the US. But what happens if in the future Argentina has a problem of balance of payments or Brazil has a problem of balance of payments, and if you have capital flight, for instance, are those reserves still powerful enough to guarantee safety? And I think it's at least debatable. Of course, this is related, and there are only two other questions I would to stress. For me at least, it's a very interesting question, is how long will this situation last? We talk a lot about the new role of BRICS and emerging countries and so on, but of course we are living a crisis, an international crisis that look like the Depression, actually of the 30s, that can last 10 years or perhaps even more, but was not a permanent situation. We were talking about some changes as if they were here to last. Perhaps it's in our interest, as it was in the 30s. In the 30s, we could do import substitution. Now, because of WTO and many negotiations, we don't have the same freedom. So what should we be doing, actually, to take advantage of the weakening of the dominance structures, that international dominance structures that a crisis brings about? This connects, and this is the last one, both to something that Gary was proposing and Rogério, which is the domestic side of this. And of course, the strength of the international voice of any country, and in particular, of course, Brazil, depends on how strong we are domestically. And this is how, actually, at least until 1 or 2 years ago, Brazil became so visible. So it is a question of, for instance, the question raised by Gary, the power and financial regulation in domestic politics. For instance, what Brazil has been doing, as an example, is applying Basel III. Basel III was decided by the Basel Committee. This is the financial regulation reform that is being implemented here. Nothing to do directly or perhaps even indirectly with financing development, as Roberto and Rogério were worried. So the domestic financial systems here, everybody knows who live in this country how politically strong, how economically important they became. How do you deal with this, and what you propose for that? So I think this was a very productive session so far, because it will continue with the general debate. Many others, this was not an exhaustive list, but I think they were points that were raised in one way or another by practically everybody in the session. So I would suggest that after the coffee break, under the the chairmanship of Fred, this could be explored in the general discussion. So the coffee break, I guess, is served somewhere in the building, there.
Also, this, the one that does not have this bag will receive one, okay? So it's a...
So thank you, and see you in, what, 5 minutes.
Hello? Fred, please. Handle it. Please. I just want to say that we are going to have lunch in this building, okay? In S1 floor. We're going to have lunch here in BNDES. So we won't really spend much time during lunchtime. So we have time to have a good session in discussing all the very interesting and important things that we had in the first session. Please, Fred. Fred, take over. Fred, please.
Hello. Hi. Well, I should wait for everyone to sit up. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Yes. I will take Cardin's wave, and we have 6 key proposals that he has pointed out in his wrap-up. One is the need to think about exchange rate. The second one is the need to think about international coordination for the financial system. The third one would be the support for free trade and how far this concept of free trade has changed in later years. The fourth one would be the systemic safety, and with a special eye in the balance of payment safety. The fifth one would be how long will the situation last, the post-crisis situation last. And the last one would be the strength of domestic conditions in order to speak in the international order. So I think we should limit ourselves to these 6 key proposals. And most important of all, we should limit ourselves to 3 minutes. We are a lot of people, and so I see Correa and Montes already wanting to speak. So I will pass the word to Correa.
Thank you, and thank you to the speakers. I'm sorry, I will not limit myself to the 6 points because I would like to suggest that maybe a 7th one is relevant. And the 7th is just the following. What do we mean by financial deregulation and financial integration? Because I was very surprised coming from the north, but this is the interest that is to share our different vision. I was very surprised that this morning all the statements were made about circulation of finance, integration, markets, exchange rates, of course, as a consequence of this, and nothing was said about financial deregulation, financial innovation, markets of derivatives, the fact that the banking system was completely impacted by the new rules of the game, that the fact that the old model of the bank initiate credit and assume the risk is abolished in favor of a new model, which is initiate the risk and disseminate and sell it. Because if we don't enter into that, I think we are in danger to miss one important part of the financial integration and financial deregulation. This is just my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Yes, please, Montes.
John, Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to point to a PowerPoint that I thought would be consistent with the financial development that is part of your kit. I'm not going to present the PowerPoint, but it's really about domestic.
Is that the website?
It's on the website, right?
Yes.
It's on. This is called Finance and Development National Policies, right? And basically, it talks about the domestic financial development that Rogerio talked about, and this is. I mean, this is part of the project that the Ford Foundation is financing our work on. And the main point the main point that I wanted to say here is that the presence of capital controls, the ability to have controls on capital inflow and outflow, is a very critical element in domestic financial development. And if you look at the second to the last page of this, there are references here. Of your handout, right? There's a reference to the second reference, which is called financial liberalization, the key issue. So in effect, this is part of the previous comment, right? This is actually a paper that was written by the author in 1992. I don't know if you remember 1992. In 1992, everybody was talking about Big Bang liberalization, and liberalization both at the external level and at the international level. I think Jan Kregel was one of the acknowledgements to this, because the author told me that in terms of finance, he was because he didn't know about finance when Yilmaz Accuse wrote this. Yilmaz Accuse is the chief economist of the South Center, right? So just to give you one flavor of the kind of analysis that happened in 1992, right? He says if you remove capital accounts, the only kind, and I think this is a proposition that comes from Jan too, right? The only kind of investment you will get, 1 minute, okay. No, I'll finish you. The only kind of investment you will get are portfolio-based investment, right? Which means it is an investment that is going in and out. So one of the impacts of this is, first of all, you're going to have higher interest rates, right? Because if your capital account is open, your own residents can change their wealth, their assets, into foreign currency, and they will require higher interest rates, right? So if you want to build your domestic financial system, you will have a then financial system that is based on high interest rates. As I think Rogerio was saying that if you're an entrepreneur, you can wait, right? You don't need any financing because you can always find a higher rate of investment. And not only that, if you have an open capital account, you actually you lose your control over the exchange rate, right? But there are all kinds of comments here, including the fact that we think that microfinance is a bad idea because it privatizes the possibility of the state providing financing for agriculture and for small-scale enterprises. So, but it's here, and the reference is actually on the website. The references are on the website. Yeah, it's in the back. This handout is in the back. It's a PowerPoint, and there are references in the.
Thank you, Manuel. Now, please, Rogerio.
I'll be very brief. And the idea, I would like to stress basically 1 and 2 points that were already stressed by my colleague Rogerio too, which is related to the, I think that we have to dig a little deep more on the idea of functionality of financial system. I think that especially to contrast with the idea of financial system efficiency. I think efficiency, okay, it's, in some senses a very good concept, but I think that we definitely have to stress on the concept of functionality of financial system. And on this, there is a relationship between functionality of financial system, the role of development banks, and how regulation, prudential financial regulation, is applied to development banks. Especially, this is one point that I think that we have to stress, which is reinforce the idea that the typical prudential regulation should not be applied to those type of institutions and should not be applied to public or state banks as well, because it could harm those institutions when they try to accomplish their mission, which is basically to reinforce the idea of functionality of financial system. These are my points.
Thank you, Rogério. Leo?
Yes, thanks. I will follow his instructions and pick up on the fourth point, which was raised, I think, mostly by Frankel, the conditions for financial safety, and I understand that as the reverse of financial instability or vulnerability. Sorry, as well as the conditions for fixing private finance. And my suggestion in terms of the research agenda would be to extend this. One of the conditions, that's my suggestion for doing that, would be to focus more on the role of the public financial sector everywhere, because what I think this crisis showed very well is that when the dirt hits the fan, then who gets in, who reigns, is always the public financial sector. If you look at the US, for cleaning the mess, if you look at Brazil and China, etc., same thing, that the best responses to the crisis were the ones that Brazil and China gave. Who was behind all that? Public financial sector. So I think that this would be a very interesting item to be stressed and to be developed as part, again, of what are the conditions necessary, not sufficient conditions for getting more financial safety, as well as helping to fix private finance. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Leo. Hernani?
Thank you. Hello. I just want to highlight some points that were in discussion. And I think we need some hierarchy on the points we are trying to pick up and trying to work more structured along those lines. One thing I would like to stress is I think it's very important how long the crisis will last. We've been 5 years already on that, and probably will take longer. Probably will be a global lost decade after Brazil's, Japan's, and things like that. But one point I'd like to stress, and I will maybe disagree with Gary Dymski, is that I don't see the states as victims of the process. In part they are, some are, I think we are. But financial globalization was a state project from US. You know? They wanted to get rid of the Bretton Woods agreement. They defaulted on their obligation to pay in gold because they want to get free to do whatever and make the world adjust automatically of what. So that's why they were not against, but they were for derivative markets. Because for hedge funds. Because they wanted them, they served their purpose. Okay, so in that point of view, I think the crisis we are going through, it's quite different from what happened in the past. Why? Because there was a political pact between high finance and high officials. Because one served the other, and one made money and another made power. This pact, in my point of view, is crushed some points. Can it go through? Can US make, let's say, use their structural power to do that? Or is it a barrier? So this is a discussion that I think people from the periphery will have to watch very carefully. It's US along themselves that will play the big role on the destiny that will come, and we'll have to follow. So in that, said that, what I want to point out that one of the aspects in how long the crisis will last is we should watch carefully what's going on in US and what are the problems and what will come over. What will happen to the banks? Will they still be hedge funds as they are 50 times leverage or not? I think that's a very important point. We'll probably have to follow. Second point I'd like to say is, although we have to watch and watch carefully, I think we, on peripheral countries, we have to have our own agenda. And two things I think is important. 1 minute. 30 seconds, not more. One is we have to protect the sovereign, because that's the most important thing. And the second thing that we have to watch carefully what kind of instruments, financial instruments, were very important for us to survive and to get through. But they they will probably, they're going to be questioned. And also, not only there, here. Yeah, if you look at what's going on in the papers in Brazil, that's that role. What state has to come out, the market. So there has interest everywhere. And we have to watch what can be done and how to support this kind of activity. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Hernani.
1 minute.
Mariana.
I wanted to sort of make a connection between Rogério Studart's last point about sort of bringing together reforming finance with industrial policy and Benjamin's point, and it's sort of a 7B to your new topic, which is that I think we really need to focus also on the degree that financialization has occurred in the real economy. Because at least in Europe, there's a trend now to think that, the problem is we have to rebalance our economies away from finance to, our industries. And so there's lists of different industries that we want to nurture and reinvigorate without really understanding how many of these industries, from pharmaceuticals, IT, biotech, even some of the creative industries that now are the focus, have been, over the last 10 years, and if you look at the data, it's peaking right before the crisis, been focusing on areas like, Bill Lazonic has done a lot of work on this, on just buying back their stock. Yeah, so the Fortune 500 companies in the last 10 years have spent $3 trillion just on buying back their stock. And the degree to which these companies now are hijacking the industrial policy debate is incredible. And just to give you 3 quick examples, because it's really only through the examples I think that we can then think of the remedies. In the UK and in the Netherlands, and I think now in Italy as well, they want to introduce this. There's something called the patent box, which is a tax cut that especially the pharmaceutical companies, but not only, are trying to get, which is targeting the income generated from patents. And as we know, patents are already monopolies. Why should you do that? You really need to target the research that leads to the patents. And so again, they've hijacked this sort of innovation debate just to have lower tax. Or the venture capital industry in both the US and in England, in the UK, but also now in the Netherlands, have captured government's imagination and basically lobbied to get 30% reductions in their capital gains tax over the last 10 years in the name of innovation, that this is actually going to increase our investment. It doesn't. We know that only increases inequality, which was both a cause and an effect of the crisis. But there's many other examples. But even the SME stuff, which I even hear in these circles, as if, what we need to do is reform finance in order to nurture SMEs, even that is a myth. Most SMEs produce no net job creation. Only something like 5% do. So really rethinking how to reform finance, targeting those types of companies that we know both produce net job creation and innovation is something very important, and we shouldn't reproduce in these circles the myths around, real economy SMEs or VC, and understand how they have captured the industrial policy debate, which has itself becoming financialized.
Thank you, Mariana. And now, Antonio.
I will dare to disobey Fred's guidelines, I'm sorry, to make it's slightly weird and possibly out of place, but brief remark to express a concern and a hope. One of the most exciting and challenging aspects of this whole initiative is the fact that it's a multidisciplinary effort. Obviously, the integration between economics and political science we're looking for is not that one that has been widely practiced by mainstream and neoclassical economists based on the representative agent and substantive rationality and so on. We want, I suppose, to develop approaches that embrace social complexity, institutions, varieties of capitalism and history. Now, I don't see it happening. Easier said than done. And I think this is one of the tasks that we are supposed to accomplish. Thinking of the Spider effort, both in terms of research and in terms of teaching. I think that this integration should start at the most basic and abstract level. And at this general and abstract level, we find that wealth and the behavior of wealth owners, which for being wealthy are also powerful, are central issues. In other terms, the study of development finance in a finance-led environment, in a context of financialization, is one of the topics that should appear prominently in a project that aims to integrate progressive economists and political scientists. It's just a methodological remark.
Thank you, Antonio. Now I have Albert.
Thank you very much. I have just a few quick points from the Chinese experience. The Chinese expansion and solution to a lot of these problems has come because of their focus on the domestic economy and on domestic growth and on the efficiency of domestic investment within a cyclical process. So they have slow growth periods and then rapid growth periods, and then the reforms can work in that engagement. But if you're going to manage your domestic demand well, you need to negotiate with the international financial community. And I think here, in a theoretical sense, and in Jan's paper, this might be added in, a situation in the world that is very important is the growth of liquidity coming out of the United States that is a kind of seigniorage. And that seigniorage is a creation of money, which then, if you go to the notion that rich countries need to take their capital surplus, invest in poor countries, is kind of blown apart. What you have is purchasing power created in the United States that enables surpluses, trade surpluses in poor countries. And so the ideal should be that poor countries should run trade surpluses, accumulate some reserves, and have limited debt, and also limited foreign ownership of their productive capacity. Not zero, but limited. These are issues of degree, and this is what China has done. And I think this liquidity expansion makes me concerned about Professor Frankel's notion that emerging economies have solved the problems of the crisis and done very well because they have been able to accumulate reserves and they have been able to reduce the risk premium on their interest rates, when in fact it seems to me that this is part of this historical period since the mid-1990s when credit creation in the United States, not from government deficits or even from activities of the Fed, but from deregulation of the financial system, has created enormous liquidity on a very little base of real hard money, and that has then flooded into the world and created, in China's case, a trade surplus it couldn't handle. So it had to just take it and reinvest it in U.S. resources. And so also coming back to Jan's paper, if you just stick with the effect of exchange rate movements, you can modify those a lot if you've really raised your labor productivity from appropriate investments so that your workers are actually earning and producing more so that their wages are going up. It changes the dynamic completely, and this, therefore, the goal seems to be has to be to change your comparative advantage as rapidly as possible, and this is what, of course, we've been talking about with Prebisch and so forth. Going back to Rogerio's point, what do we do with the domestic financial system? The Chinese solution and the U.S. solution until the late 1960s was to repress your financial system, to keep, for example, caps on interest rates so that you could maintain low costs for some of the things that were in the public interest. In those cases, Fannie and Freddie, housing. When you took away the American caps, then our mortgage financing institutions suddenly became illiquid. And so the Chinese have capped interest rates, and it's a tax on depositors. I think it's a justified tax. It's a good tax. And if they're not willing to take any risk, they should earn really no real return. But that money then is low cost for the investment by the banking system in policy loans or investing in purchasing of development bank paper that have the long-term view, because a lot of the studies of the Chinese financial system focus on the banking system and say it will be more efficient if they liberalize. But if you liberalize the financial system as the banks only, you make the whole financial system, including the financing of public goods, less efficient. So that there's a trade-off between what's thought of as efficiency in the banking system and what is efficiency for the overall financial system that can fund long-term investments. So my proposal for how to do this in a global environment that's quite hostile is for countries like Japan and China to come together with new standards. And I think we've seen a bit of this already in the BRICS thinking about their own development bank. But if you could come up with both a development agency and an international collaboration between China and Brazil that then could include other sympathetic countries in it as an alternative to following the Washington led group of really rich country power brokers, you could form a consensus about capital controls as a first best solution to running your country as an independent domestic body. And I think that would be really a way out of the box we're in, because the power is so great still in the hands of the rich countries governing standards, that we need to set separate standards, and Brazil and China together could do that.
Thank you, Albert. Fernando.
Comentar as exposições. Eu vou falar sobre taxa de câmbio, comentando do Frank, o Craig e o professor Bresser, e depois, se dando tempo, eu comento sobre o financiamento do Rogério e do Dinsky. Eu acabei de ler o texto muito sintético, muito bem feito do Frank, e me coloquei a seguinte questão. Se é tão fácil, por que não foi feito antes? Né? Por que não se adotou um regime de câmbio flexível antes? Por que não se acumulou reservas antes? Antes, eu estou falando, nos anos 90, e não nessa década. Então, vendo isso de maneira estilizada, eu diria que antes tinha uma prioridade interna, que era combater a inflação. Então, se adotasse um câmbio flexível, o medo é que a moeda disparasse e teria um choque inflacionário. E depois, com a oportunidade do boom de commodities da China, que não apareceu esse aspecto no seu paper, propiciou, via fluxo comercial, um acúmulo de reservas, e aí sim a moeda se apreciou e conseguiu a prioridade interna e externa. Sobre o que o Klegel escreveu, ele chamou atenção no paper dele, mais do que na exposição, um ponto muito interessante a respeito da solução de um câmbio duplo, e mostra que isso é incompatível com as normas do FMI. Adotar um câmbio duplo, um favorável por cada diferença da produtividade, um favorável ao setor exportador de commodities agrícolas e outro favorável a uma indústria exportadora. É o que o professor Brest chama de um combate à doença holandesa. Né? Seria a solução câmbio duplo. Aí o professor Brest coloca como uma solução, quer dizer, fazer uma desvalorização da moeda nacional e fazer um imposto de exportação sobre essa, que a receita dos commodities agrícolas vai crescer muito, então faz um imposto de exportação a respeito. Sempre que ele coloca isso, eu me lembro se o doutor Caiado, a doutora Cátia Abreu vai aprovar, a bancada ruralista vai aprovar isso. Eu sempre penso na viabilidade política disso. Mas eu penso também na viabilidade política que isso vai representar um choque cambial e um choque inflacionário, coisa que o Craig chama a atenção. Esse choque inflacionário contamina os custos da indústria, pelo lado dos salários e pelo lado dos insumos importados. Então, eu acho que essa solução do imposto ainda tem que ser pensada, não é uma solução, mesmo se fosse aprovada politicamente, tem o choque inflacionário que pode tirar a vantagem que a desvalorização cambial apresentaria, seria corroída por uma inflação de custos. Então, eu acho que a gente ainda tem que refletir a respeito. Eu vou concluir só fazendo um comentário que esse novo arranjo de política econômica, que o Frank chamou atenção, no caso brasileiro, nessa década, propiciou uma queda da relação da dívida pública em relação ao PIB, coisa muito diferente dos países capitalistas maduros. Então, nos últimos tempos, o BNDES, Caixa Econômica Federal, Banco do Brasil, tiveram a condição de fazer uma atuação anticíclica, financiar o desenvolvimento, usando o espaço que foi criado no mercado de títulos para dirigir esses títulos para o desenvolvimento. Capitaliza, quer dizer, esquematicamente, o Tesouro capta títulos de dívida pública atualmente, até aumenta um pouco a dívida pública, tem espaço para isso, capitaliza os bancos e os bancos financiam o desenvolvimento. Houve uma experiência, o Hernani fez um paper destacando isso, de lançamento de títulos corporativos, debêntures e letras financeiras. Letras financeiras são os debêntures dos bancos. Esses títulos, os bancos fizeram operações de lançamento, operações estruturadas, e jogaram na carteira de fundos. Eles estão sendo carregados com fundos assim, de um certo curto prazo, e é uma experiência que aumenta o prazo do fund, mas não soluciona. O que está sendo discutido hoje, atualmente, no Brasil, é o setor, o governo, financiar bancos privados para fazer consórcio para financiar o pacote de infraestrutura. O que é uma discussão politicamente também delicada, porque é o uso de dinheiro público para lucro privado, usar o fundos sociais. Então, é esses os comentários.
Thank you, Fernando. And Daniela.
Hello. Okay. It's only 3 minutes, is this? Okay. I would like to point out one thing that I think that is important to the Spider. One important thing to be researched by the Spider, that we need to think about the changes in the international economy after the crisis, not only how long this situation, this crisis situation will last, but I think that, and I will focus on the emerging countries because I don't have time, but the crisis, I think that has result in new challenges and opportunities for emerging countries. In fact, I think that emerging countries, and such as Brazil, has been affected by the crisis. I think that we have a huge contagion effect on Brazil, and I think that this has highlighted that the strategy adopted before the crisis, as Franco mentioned, accumulate reserves and reduce the external debt, was not sufficient. And after that, besides the international financial system, the reforms that we would like was not launched, has not been launched because of power of interest. The emerging countries has changed, some of them has changed his strategy and has adopted a broader approach on capital flows management, not only capital controls, but prudential regulation. So I think that the strategy of how to integrate in the financial globalization has changed. Maybe not so, and has changed because of the own reaction of some emerging countries, and Brazil is an example. And in the case of Brazil, we have a new government, so it's also related with this new forced correlation of this new government. So I think that this is important. We need to look at how countries has the response of the emerging countries, and this response has been shaped and need to be shaped by the each country institutional financial system and financial arrangement. So in case of Brazil, and Benjamin has mentioned, the derivative market has had an essential impact on the exchange rate before the crisis. And from my point of view, is more important than trade, commodity price, and capital flows. And after the crisis, because of the reaction of the government that adopted new regulation, this has changed. And so I think this is one point. And other thing that I think that very important, the international trade has changed also after the crisis. The competition has increased, and China, the role of China needs to be, we need to think about the impact of China in the export capacity of developing emerging countries as Brazil. So I think that after the crisis, the concurrence of China, because China has benefited Brazil because of the commodity price. But I think that we need to think about it.
Yes. Now, Fisher.
Oh, well, while I'm talking, I also try and just throw up one slide because I wanted to make a point with it. I'm not sure how to do that, though, right now. Just a second. Do you think you can do it? I mean, just for the sake of debate, I wanted to, very respectfully, obviously, take contention with Luis's criticism of the idea of basically running trade deficits, and the structuralists, the old structuralists, point of view that that was necessary for more of a developmental agenda, which I think Jan Kregel's paper and presentation really clearly pointed out. And I'll ignore that. And possibly a suggestion is that the more important focus is not so much a question of yes or no foreign finance, but more a question of transforming the type of finance that we rely on. But nonetheless, with a recognition of the necessity of foreign finance, particularly in the context of late industrialization, development, and so on. And in that sense, I think Jan's point at the end of his paper for that we need a more ambitious or radical approach to thinking of reforming the international financial architecture could be taken in that direction, particularly towards a much greater increased role for concessional financing, which stresses the issues of high interest rates and so on, or even grants, the return to grants, returning to some of the original agendas of the World Bank, for instance, which was to finance development with concessional long-term loans. And in particular, putting on the agenda the need for fundamentally redistributive international financial transfers from rich to poor countries. And the two reasons, one is because I think, as the structuralist pointed out, and as Jan was arguing, the tendency for late industrializing countries to run trade deficits, which is a historical reality, China being a recent exception, but only since the mid to late 90s. Even in European historical experience, that was the case. The Marshall Plan was based on that understanding, as Jan's paper pointed out. But even you could even argue in colonial Europe, one of the benefits of the colonies was that European colonial countries were able to use colonies to balance their trade balances with other competing industrial powers. But there's also, the second reason is because of the tendency within capitalism for increasing concentration of wealth, power, and so on. And the short of trickle down, the major counteracting force against that is basic redistributive mechanisms within the economy, the major one of which, within nation states, of course, is fiscal policy, government-led fiscal policy, or migration, out-migration from deficit areas of people. But at the international level, beyond the nation state, we've basically failed in an international sense in instituting any real sense of redistributed transfers, particularly since the 60s. So that's my basic argument, which I've written about, but I just wanted to then show you this slide, because I think when we're talking about the argument of earning our way as opposed to borrowing our way out of these types of issues, in the back of our mind, without saying it, we always have the archetypal cases of Republic of Korea, for instance, South Korea, or perhaps Taiwan. And I think I just want to make my point with this slide, which is basically actually Korea proves the argument actually with striking degree of evidence, where you have right through the 60s, they were running a massive trade deficit of running around 10% of GDP. Which at first they were only able to finance because of huge inflows of aid, basically from the US and then later from Japan, also at 10% of GDP. Now I know there's a geopolitical context behind this, but the point is what do we learn from this about how they actually successfully achieve their types of development experiences? And then even as we enter into the 70s, they're still running, even though they're very successful in exporting, they're importing faster than they're exporting. And they're only able to achieve that through, as grants start to fall off, they move into loans. So they were borrowing their way through the trade deficits to a large degree, first through more concessional forms of loaning and then borrowing, and then more commercial forms. And of course, there's also the services account is quite interesting, because government services were a major, giving them about 2% surplus to compensate for the trade deficit. But that was, of course, the Korean government supplying military services to the US and Vietnam, which is not an experience we wish to repeat. But it's only when they hit the 80s when they actually start to become the archetypal case of trade surpluses. I could make many other points there, but I'd run out of time apparently. This is, of course, the financial account, which also has some very interesting lessons, which I don't have the time to explain. But of course, if you look at the first bulge there, the red line in the 80s when they were going through the debt crisis, basically you see the capital account is being matched by debt. And then it's only then post-East Asian crisis where the capital account is being nicely correlated with reserve accumulation rather than debt accumulation. or debt deaccumulation. But throughout the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, what you see is the capital account is basically reflecting debt accumulation and deaccumulation. And I mean, the point, I just wanted to, I talked to Arthur about, Albert, about this briefly, but I think China up to the mid-90s also proves this experience in the sense that what you see in China is as they start to grow rapidly in the reform period, they sink into quite substantial trade deficits. The black line there going to negative 4% of GDP in 1985 when the economy was taking off and inflation was also taking off. And they only correct that tendency of trade deficits by relative degrees of austerity, not austerity as Latin America experienced. And that's the only way they bring it back into surplus. But as soon as they then take off into higher rates of growth, inflation takes off and also they run into deficits again. So I think the key question in the Chinese case is how did they break that pattern in the 90s, basically? And I'm hoping to get some answers for that for that question in the session on China, but I'm sure there's a huge debate about that. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you, Fisher. Giovanni, please.
Can you turn it off?
Can you turn it off?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Two short historical comments and some more contemporary reflection. The historical comments are first that one has never seen before the so-called globalization the joint liberalization of finance and trade. In the last part of the 19th century, true, there was the gold standard that as such had a deflationary effect on the world economy. But at the same time, you had a lot of trade protection and industrial policies. And the major example there were the United States. And even that broke down for different reasons that essentially had to do with changing international balances in income per capita and productivity, etc. I think that the current globalization, with both international financial liberalization and trade liberalization, is simply unsustainable. Is unsustainable for different reasons for developed countries and developing countries. Second unique feature of the contemporary economy, despite what the bleeps that Andrew was showing us, is that this is the first case in which you have a massive industrialization in a country that is as big as a continent that runs a surplus with the rest of the world. These are the two, and this pose big question marks on the management of the internal and international political economy. A little parenthesis on that. I heard a bit too much a sort of fatalistic approach to, let's put it this way, to globalization, as if it were a tsunami or an asteroid. I mean, for example, the East Asian crisis of 97-98 shows that states still have some power if they want to exert it. And if they want, they can tell the IMF to fuck off, as they did in East Asia, and as they did not, by and large, in Latin America. I think one should not understate the degrees of freedom that countries still have if they want to have, and if they don't have too many Ministry of the Economy who got the PhD in the United States. Then, related to that, the last issue is, well, probably if you want to fully industrialize, you need to manage trade flows. Certainly you need to manage capital flows. But maybe you need to manage also trade flows. Let's not forget that, as Antonio Castro was repeating insightfully, we are living in an increasingly sinocentric world in which manufacturing is accumulated there, and China has the absolute increasingly has the absolute advantage on almost everything. Then asking issues about comparative advantage does not make much sense. And relatedly, do we think that a commodity-driven income growth is viable and is leading to sustained unemployment, sustained capability accumulation, etc.? Personally, I don't think so. But we'll have time the next few days. I was trying to make the link between this discussion on the financial side and the discussion on the real economy that we are going to have in the next few days, I hope.
Thank you, Giovanni. Puga.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do is talking a little about things that Hernani mentioned, also Gary Dinsky mentioned, and also Fernando Gardin mentioned when he was talking about the IMF changing of mind regarding capital controls and so forth. At the beginning of this year, I was at San Diego at this American Economic Association, and one thing that strikes me that in the main panel of monetary policy, what they mention is that if your model has the letter M, if your model has M, money, well, you should throw this model away. What they are putting in place, the things that we now having they are now having a Fed that is doing a very different job since the burst of the financial crisis. It's a Fed that is buying bonds, is intervening in the mortgage credits, is in fact doing much different from what we have heard of the Washington Consensus and so forth. So it's a different model. They are implementing models where credit is much more important. When you have different markets, where the central bank make intervention on these markets, and it goes directly related to that bank, to BNDES. It's a major. The idea is that government should play this policy, should make intervention on the markets. Should the market doesn't function that well as people think, even mainstream policymakers. So yes, we should make intervention. We should. The central bank is also, not only the BNDES, also Fed is doing that. Well, it's really shocking for us. So I think that's a good agenda in terms of studying that new development, how the way things are changed, this new recognition of the importance of the developing banks. We are also getting together the development banks in terms of creating this development banks union. It's going to be much more important. Some years ago, we used to think that we were a jabuticaba, and it's a Brazilian fruit. Well, we are not a jabuticaba. We have all of the BRICS banks has development banks. Now, countries that don't have development banks are wanting to have development banks. So it's a new world, a new agenda.
Sorry, what is this developing bank union? Is there some organization being created?
It gathered BNDES, all of the JBIC, Japanese, the JBIC, the IDF, the name is IDFC, International Development Financial Club. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Puga. Oreiro.
Bom, vou aproveitar que o Fernando Costa fez a apresentação dele em português, vou pegar uma carona.
Tá? Até porque a minha intervenção também é sobre câmbio, e o Fernando Costa colocou na apresentação dele de que não é fácil mudar a taxa de câmbio. Realmente não é mesmo. Até porque você envolve, quer dizer, toda vez que você muda o câmbio de forma permanente, você tem mudanças na distribuição de renda, que são importantes, e também impacto inflacionário. Isso significa o seguinte, que para você realmente mudar a taxa de câmbio em países em desenvolvimento, particularmente no caso do Brasil, que é o que me interessa, não basta, e aí eu discordo um pouco do Bresser, simplesmente colocar um imposto sobre a exportação de commodities, mas você tem que mudar todo o regime de política macroeconômica. Tá? O Brasil, por alguma razão que talvez só a política entenda, ainda mantém um tripé macroeconômico que foi herdado do segundo mandato do presidente Fernando Henrique Cardoso e que, curiosamente, meio morto, meio vivo, mas ainda está de pé, mas a gente precisa mudá-lo se é que nós realmente desejamos fazer uma mudança consistente na taxa de câmbio. E eu acho que uma das formas de você fazer uma mudança consistente na taxa de câmbio sem retornar ao passado de alta inflação ou quase hiperinflação que você teve no Brasil, é realmente adotar políticas de renda. Quer dizer, por alguma razão, apesar de nós já estamos no terceiro mandato de um governo dito de esquerda, progressista, etc., o debate sobre políticas de renda simplesmente desapareceu, né, da agenda de política econômica ou da agenda de discussão. Tá? Eu acho que isso é fundamental para que a gente possa ter uma inflação razoável, em torno de 4%, 4,5% ao ano, e fazer uma desvalorização da taxa de câmbio. Com essa taxa de câmbio que está aí, R$ 1,95, R$ 2,00, eu tenho absoluta certeza que a taxa de investimento brasileira vai continuar no mesmo patamar medíocre que ela está. Quer dizer, eu já fiz algumas estimativas econométricas com a professora Eliane Araújo, da Universidade Estadual de Maringá, em que a gente estimou uma função de acumulação de capital para a economia brasileira, que é uma função não linear na taxa de câmbio. Tá? Nós ainda estamos com uma sobrevalorização entre 25% a 30% da taxa de câmbio. Nós precisaríamos de uma taxa de câmbio bem mais desvalorizada do que nós temos hoje. O problema é que se você for dar um choque de 20%, 25% na taxa de câmbio hoje, a inflação vai passar de 10%. E uma vez que ela passa de 10%, a memória inflacionária brasileira volta rapidinho, e aí nós vamos jogar fora todo o passado de luta contra a inflação que nós tivemos até agora. Então, realmente preciso mudar o regime de política macroeconômica, é preciso introduzir política de rendas, particularmente uma coisa que pode parecer um pouco direitosa, etc., mas eu acho que é necessária, que é uma política de moderação salarial que seja negociada com os sindicatos. Isso é fundamental para que a gente possa ter uma inflação estável, e baixa, ter uma taxa de câmbio mais desvalorizada e, com isso, a gente poder ter aí uma taxa de investimento entre 23% a 25% do PIB, sem a qual o Brasil não consegue crescer entre 4,5% e 5% ao ano de forma sustentada no médio e longo prazo. Era isso que eu tinha para dizer. Obrigado.
Por favor, André.
Bem, eu vou falar em português também. Eu acho que eu pego um pouco a carona no que o Loureiro falou, e talvez um pouco também do que o Fernando Nogueira falou. Na verdade, rapidinho, eu só queria trazer o aspecto sociológico e político do desenvolvimento. O desenvolvimento econômico, ele traz mudanças estruturais e, com isso, incerteza, problemas de coordenação. E como é que a gente resolve isso? A gente resolve isso com convenções. Então, o que é uma convenção de desenvolvimento? A convenção de desenvolvimento é uma forma de você mitigar esses problemas de incerteza e de coordenação, por um lado. Mas, por outro lado, as convenções de desenvolvimento elas são sempre apresentadas como visando ao bem comum, visando o bem geral de toda a nação. Mas, no entanto, as convenções de desenvolvimento elas atendem interesses muito específicos. Então, para dar o exemplo aqui no país, até muito pouco tempo, talvez ainda vigora essa convenção de que as taxas de juros altas e o câmbio valorizado eram fundamentais para o desenvolvimento do Brasil. Então, nesse sentido, para chamar a atenção, falou-se aqui da importância dos regimes de política econômica, da importância das instituições, mas da importância das ideias também. Porque eu acho que todo mundo aqui concorda que o câmbio valorizado e os juros altos não favorecem o desenvolvimento econômico. Mas isso foi vendido como tal. E aí, só para finalizar, Então, na verdade, o desenvolvimento ele vai mexer em interesses constituídos. Ele vai afetar os grupos de interesses de uma forma constituída. E eu acho que a Spider ela tem um papel fundamental para estar ajudando a gente a desenvolver ou produzir uma nova convenção de desenvolvimento para a economia brasileira em particular e para os países em desenvolvimento em geral. Só isso.
Thank you, André. Cadu. No. He will be last because he spoke before, and so he can answer things here.
Okay. My comment will be in line with the two previous one by André and Oreiro. It's not a comment on the debate, which is quite excellent, but what is missing in this debate, and especially for a research, innovative, new idea for development, which is what are the implications of new or different designs of financial instruments to development understood as a more generic issue rather than only trade or inflation or the usual macroeconomic indicators. We have this trend to have the debate on finance, either on what are the macroeconomic consequences of finance, or what are the consequence of financial reform to the financial sector, but the financial sector is not the economy as a whole. So my suggestion is in line with Fernando has just said about what is the role of development. There's some consensus here that national development banks have important role in the 21st century agenda, which is what we can improve in terms of what are the social and environmental consequences of these new financial instruments, just to broaden the debate in the sense that they are not neutral. And I know by my own experience how difficult it is for BNDES, the National Development Bank in Brazil, to incorporate these new agendas because you're not used to do it. The way the financial instrument, the institution is designed is not to answer this kind of issues. So if you're looking for a new issue, a new innovative thing, so have more dialogue between this financial debate with the other development sectors.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm closing inscriptions here. We have okay, so the last one is Lavínia, then we'll have Roberto and Dembski. Okay?
Eu vou falar em inglês porque os termos de Basileia 3 são todos em inglês, então não adianta muito. So maybe I have a genetic predisposition to see good aspects and subjects that everybody criticizes a lot, including my own friends. So let's just make a few points about Basel III. I think we should recognize that at least theoretically, Basel III is about the BIS took some steps in the direction we always claimed for. First is recognizing, after the crisis, is recognizing the importance of liquidity risk. The second one is recognizing that we need a comprehensive view regulation system. They recognize that we have blind spots of regulation, and that is too dangerous. And another thing that they talked about is macroprudential regulations. Well, on the other hand, it's too much. The agreement is becoming an elephant. I am a risk manager. You can't imagine how much the structure is becoming too complex. So I think we should think a little more open about those questions. And what I think is what we need really to think, and I think this is the space, is to have the whole idea, is to have a new monetary and financial order. Should we discuss like a Bretton Woods tree and things like that? We need to think both the financial and the BP, okay, balance of payments. So thank you.
Thank you, Lavínia. Roberto?
3 points related. First, to the comments by Professor Caden. If a country have a current surplus, it means that it's reducing net external debt or is accumulating net external assets. If it can do it in 3 ways: if the private sector, a public sector accumulation of assets, for instance, these new sovereign funds, or when the central bank accumulates the assets, we call it reserves, because the central bank is the only one that has the ability to exchange dollar for domestic currency. So necessarily, if the central bank or a sovereign fund doesn't accumulate reserve, because a current account surplus always is an attractor of capital, the exchange rate will appreciate, and then the current account surplus will disappear. So the accumulation of reserves is necessary consequences of the preservation of the current account surplus. Okay. Second, regarding the comments by Fernando Costa, we had these policies in the past. Precisely in the mid-60s, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, and Brazil adopted passive crawling pegs, which mean indexing the exchange rate in order to preserve the real exchange rate. And it was a very successful policy because the best growing period, the miracle in the case of Brazil, and also was a very good growth period in Argentina and Colombia also, is the period where the countries adopted this exchange. Then, with the acceleration of inflation that came with the debt crisis of the early 80s, the countries started, no, before that, Chile and Argentina, that generated the hyperinflation without external shocks. No, the left government in Chile and the populist government of the Peron in Argentina generated our own shocks and put the countries in a hyperinflation regime. Then the military regimes, in order to control this very high inflation, I wrote on that, I call it high inflation regimes, 10% monthly, you remember? 10% monthly. Then they had adopted fixed exchange rate in order to fight this and generated the kind of crisis that anticipated the 90s crisis in the case of Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. And then all the country has to adopt fixed exchange rate, except Brazil, that never adopted fixed exchange rate in order to fight inflation. Other countries had already fixed exchange rate at the time when they opened their capital accounts. For instance, the Asian countries. These Asian countries in the first half of the 90s, they had already fixed exchange rate regimes as everybody before the broken of they continue with fixed exchange rate after 1973. And for instance, Russia suffered a crisis, had fixed exchange rate because the IMF used this anchor in order to stop the very high inflation that Russia had. Taking the example of Argentina that adopted. So all the crises, or the financial crisis of the globalization period, took place in context of fixed exchange rates. And all the crises were currency crisis in this sense, except Brazil in 82. Because Brazil in 82 had a public debt crisis, not a financial crisis. It's different. We put it all together, but Brazil was a debt crisis without currency crisis and without financial crisis. Nothing to do with Argentina, Chile. But it was a debt crisis for everybody in the sense that all the crises were debt crises at that time. But not currency crisis, neither financial. And lastly, Oreiro, dear friend, we are always pushing for the same. Yeah, Germany applies this policy, no? And this is the problem of the Eurozone, because Germany applies this policy and not the other countries that enjoy the expansion generated by capital inflows. Why the Germans fix a 2% inflation target and then talk with the trade unions in order to coordinate wage policy and with monetary policy? So, whom we should blame for the crisis, the Germans or the Spaniards? No, both are responsible, you know?
Thank you. Dinsky, please.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to respond first to Fernando's last point. I would have put it that the agenda was not so much, I think what Rogério and I were talking about was not so much the domestic financial policies and strategies and so on, but more broadly, financial strategies and institutional developments
as a whole should be incorporated. And this came out, I think, a lot in the debate. And if I could just say that, Hernani, I have Robert as my witness that the point I didn't get to was to talk about the U.S. as a global liquidity sink. It's written right there. And, and actually, we're on the same page. That's right, that as Varoufakis has written very forcefully, that the flipping from Bretton Woods, and that's one strategy, into the post-Bretton Woods scenario, to kind of this kind of jujutsu, you know, to make a weakness into a strength, and then to become a global liquidity sink and set up your financial champions to dominate the world with securitization-based instruments. That's a hell of a policy, and it's now at its end. And the weakness, of course, is the weakness of governments who are trapped in some way and unable to move. And this is very many of the global north countries. I would just say, you know, where we're living now, the UK, where their debt to GDP ratio goes from 70 to about 180 once they eat the debt of RBS and their other big banks, and they don't know what to do with that. They've taken it on, and they're too weak to stand up to their financial sector. They're still battling the Eurozone to try to, you know, make sure that Frankfurt doesn't tell the City of London what to do. But this goes to a critical point about then the shadow banks that come up in the frame of this and that get defended implicitly. It goes to the points that you were saying, Fernando, about, you know, the importance of really looking at this new world, and people emphasize this. What world are we in? Danielle, you talked about that. What world are we in here where we have the central banks in the global north doing quantitative easing, 1, 2, 3, participating in ways that they never have, and I think being locked into interest rate strategies. I think we have a global lock-in right now in the global south whose consequences are actually unimagined in terms of the next phase. It's a short-termism as a global solution mechanism for countries that are now no longer dominant and able to exert their will, except by destroying the global economy. And finally, this goes to the points that a number of people made. Kadu mentioned, and Mariana, Lavinia talked about the importance of really thinking about something we were emphasizing, the functionality of the financial system. But then I really like this idea of the design of financial instruments, because we know that the chambers of power that you've talked about, and that say the Dodd-Frank, the rules in those chambers of power for the new instruments and the control of the shadow institutions and all that have been made up and controlled, and the dialogues have been the monopoly of the lawyers and special representatives of the global banks. They're the only ones who can keep up with it, and actually we know that they cannot. And so essentially it's crucial in this new regime and this new spider that there be serious attention to the legal aspects and the kind of the move from what we hope will be a common law regime of global finance, where essentially you can do whatever you want until someone stops you or doesn't, to a more of Rousseauian world where basically the financial markets are understood, and the financial institutions, as servants of the states in which they are functional or not, or they shouldn't go there, and in which essentially there's the capacity of the laws to keep that under control. And the question for the global South nations and BRICS shouldn't be, you know, opt in, opt out. I think there's no way to win that game. It's got to be to play the game differently. And I think Spider actually has to be at the center of this thinking, because if it doesn't happen with the people in this room, and I'm talking about people whose contributions to this debate are fundamental for years, it's not going to happen. And I think, you know, it's our obligation to carry this forward to the next generation, to give them a little something to work with.
Hello, thank you, Gary. Yeah, please.
Just very briefly, I can't resist making a comment on developing new instruments. You know, Keynes told us that economists should be like dentists, and also that banks should be boring. New instruments prevent banks from being boring. First point. Second point, I want to agree on one condition with Rogerio. I certainly would be in favor of China giving up its current development policy if it had any possibility of having an impact on international imbalances. I don't believe that it does. In fact, I'm certain that it would not. Secondly, I would also be in favor if I believed that giving up those international imbalances would create financial stability. And I do not believe that that would happen. So the problem is that we don't want to confuse multilateral cooperation with the question of the impact of imbalances. Now, it's quite clear that we know the current crisis was not caused in any way, shape, or form by the existence of international imbalances. Primarily, as we now know, well, we would have known if we had read Keynes, but we didn't. We now read Claudio Borio, and Claudio Borio tells us exactly the same thing. That is, it was the creation of international liquidity by means of all of these newfangled financial instruments, which caused the international gross capital flows, which allowed those international imbalances to be built up. So let's focus on what is the real cause. We can have as much multilateral cooperation as we can, but unfortunately all the multilateral cooperation within the multilateral financial institutions tends to be focused on international imbalances. And even under the new MAP program, in which it is now recognized that some sort of imbalance may be okay, and again, this brings to mind the idea of, being sort of pregnant is okay, but, you don't want to be really. And if you look at their results, they give a very nice matrix of those countries that are good and those countries that are bad. And the ones that all fall into the bad category just happen to be those that have very large, guess what, international imbalances. So despite the fact that they give lip service to the acceptance that maybe imbalances are not the cause of the problem, they continue to formulate and impose policies to eliminate those imbalances. And as long as those imbalances tend to occur within countries that are developing, or the counterparts, as Albert has pointed out, the counterparts of the countries that are developing, they are going to be detrimental to the development process.
Right. Thank you, Jan. I think we have finished our session. I would like to say some words wrapping up what has been said here. First of all, we began the session with Benjamin talking about deregulation and the need to tackle some issues such as financial innovation, and we ended the session with Ian saying something very similar to what Benjamin has talked about. So I think we should include this topic in the financial part of our web. Second, I believe that many people have talked about functionality, and Mariana, Ian, Dinsky, and now we need not only to talk about functionality, but about its links, the link of the financial system with the real world, which has also been pointed out by Giovanni. And there has been a debate on devaluation strategies here and on the need for income distribution policies to be linked to financial strategies. So I think that's another topic that we should include in the agenda. And fourth, some people have called for the need for a more profound theoretical debate during the research that will be carried out among the web. So I think that this should be a fourth topic. I would like to thank everyone for being so succinct, for their short speeches, and that helped a lot. We made something, we cut 15 minutes in our session in order to sacrifice some of the things that should be said here, and 21 people spoke. Okay, thank you very much.
Now we have lunch at the floor S1, okay, behind. We have lunch here for everybody, please.